Welcome back to Kings of Columbus, huge one. Doug Lesmerises, Bill Landis, Ohio State at Oregon Saturday night. Bill, we're going to start with some texture Q&A. And then we will have our big game breakdown of this game. And just off the top to tell people what's going on, because we like to be upfront with our audiences. This is the biggest game in Northern college football this regular season in terms of what really matters. You know, Ohio State, Michigan is what it is, but it's 2 versus 3. It's the Northern version of Alabama versus Georgia. So obviously this is a huge game for Kings of the North, which is the other show that we do. So we are doing a big game breakdown, we call it, on Kings of the North of Ohio State, Oregon. That is the same thing that we want to do here. So we're not going to do it twice. So we're going to do a big chunk of texter Q&A, what matters to you guys, with some texter survey stuff to start this show. Then we're going to run the big game breakdown in the second half of the show that we did on Wednesdays, Kings of the North, on YouTube and also on podcasts. So if you listen to both shows, that is the same. But we wanted to make sure it hit both audiences. There are people who only listen to one show, and it didn't make sense to do that 40-minute breakdown twice, Landis. So we just want to tell people what's up.
Yeah, it's the exact same conversation we would have had otherwise. We just didn't want to record it twice because that sounds a little insane to do. So
yeah. And actually last week we did Iowa, Ohio State as a big game breakdown on Kings of the North, but it wasn't as long. So we did a longer one on this show and a shorter one on KOTN. You can't go too long on a breakdown of Ohio State, Oregon with how huge this game is. So we'll probably go like 100 minutes on each show.
I was going to say like 4 hours, 4 or 5 hours. Okay.
Yeah, it's what the people want. We give the people what they want. So anyway, we're not trying to trick you. And we do know there are some of you who listen to both. But we want to start with stuff like, hey, what do you guys want to talk about? What do you care about with this game? And I do have some survey questions. We do something with our texters every Friday where I've started just saying like, hey, do you know, asking you about the spread. Would you give the points or take the points with Ohio State? Whatever. Not take the points, but I asked that now because I want to see where people's heads are at, and just also like some excitement level, some nerve level. I'm curious about that with Ohio State fans. So anyway, we don't have to keep explaining the show. We can just do the show. The first question, Landis, is about Ohio State's coverage. And I have 2 questions. This is defensively. This is Craig. My question is whether Jim Knowles will allow his corners to play more press man so the defensive front can get pressure and hits on Dylan Gabriel. I watched the Michigan State game last weekend, and Gabriel is a different quarterback when pressured or hit. This is Oregon versus Michigan State. He's also not a big guy. So the one hit he took really rocked him. I believe Oregon will get their fair share of yardage with all the athletes, but it's crucial to get pressure on the QB, especially in the red zone. So Craig in San Diego wants more press man, and he's not the only one. Kyle P. from the 614. In the last few games, we've watched the defense play soft in their coverages, and it's been very frustrating to watch because Michigan State and Iowa exposed that in the first half, and it took us way too long to adjust. Do you think we are playing soft coverage in preparation for Oregon? Are we trying to maybe throw Oregon off and our corners will play more press coverage against them? So this is not the first time we've had this conversation, Landis, but it's the first time we've applied it to the Oregon game. How do you think Ohio State will and should play coverage against the Ducks?
I think we'll probably see the most mix we've seen to this point. The reason Ohio State plays soft coverage or has played soft coverage is it does not want to give up explosive plays to teams that have no business getting them against Ohio State. So it doesn't want to make a game against a game against Iowa or Michigan State or Marshall or West Virginia or Akron more interesting than it needs to be because you're playing press man the whole time and they end up with like 2 or 3 40-yard plays because of that. Jim Knowles has flipped his methodology to, I think, being accepting of giving up some big plays to being fearful of them entirely. I think that's a carryover from what happened his first year here in the Georgia game.
Justifiably, game. I think.
Justifiably. Yeah. No, I think so too. But I do think you need to mix it up. And honestly, I thought we saw more kind of press, more aggressive stuff sort of creeping into the game plan against Iowa last week, which felt like a little bit like a ramp up. So I don't know that I'm expecting Ohio State to come out against Oregon and just play in their grill the entire time, because the other thing you worry about with that is Oregon running a lot of pick plays and using that against you. And you want to allow yourself some space to make sure you have that stuff covered. And I think allow yourself some space to make sure you're tackling on the perimeter the way you need to in this game. But I also Oregon is like kind of small at receiver too, so there's probably is some benefit to getting up on those guys and being pretty physical with them. So I have found it as frustrating as everyone else, some of the stuff that Ohio State has allowed because of soft coverage. I do think there was a method behind it, and I think in this game it'll be maybe not quite as prominent as it has been the first 5 games.
Yeah, I am not frustrated by it when they only give up 7 to Michigan State and they don't allow Iowa to score until the backups are in. So like I'm a little, I don't want to say confused, but I raised my eyebrows a bit of like, what exactly? Like, are people worried about the results or the style? Or if the goal is to keep teams from scoring, I like it. Doesn't it work? Hasn't it worked?
Yeah, it does. I have gone back and forth on it too. I was like, are we talking too much about this? Like, I feel like during the game, I'm like, I can't believe they gave up another first down. And then after the game, I'm like, oh, that team scored 1 touchdown and had 4 first downs all game. So it's like, I don't know. It's one of those things that in the moment you're a little more heated about it than you are with some time to actually analyze why it was happening. So I'm not as keyed up on it as I was kind of during the game at points on Saturday, but I think maybe part of the concern comes from the thought that you're gonna have to play some press in this game, like you're gonna have to be physical with your defensive backs in this game, and they haven't done it a whole lot. So when they're asked to do it, will they be able to do it? I think maybe is a fair question.
And that's always a fair thing for Ohio State. I mean, like that's the way you and I have covered the team forever, which is, okay, this happened, but what does it mean for the next game? What does it mean for the big games? Is it going to hurt them down the line? So a couple things on Oregon. And I just want to tell people here, we're going to answer your questions when you ask them here. We may say a similar thing in the big game breakdown when we're breaking the team down, pass game, run game, both sides of the ball. Oregon does not throw deep that often, but when they do throw deep, they're pretty good at it, and they will take a shot. They took a shot like on the first play of the game last week, the Michigan State game last week. So you do have to be aware of Dylan Gabriel going down the field. They hung in the game with Boise. They hit a huge play to set up a touchdown, then they hit another huge play for a touchdown. Like Dylan Gabriel actually throws a pretty good deep ball. So what Oregon doesn't do is throw anything middle. Dylan Gabriel, is this the team that we talked about, dunks and threes? I was thinking about our dunks and threes conversation. Is it about Oregon?
Yeah.
Okay. So it's dunks and threes, and it's mostly dunks. They do not have a mid-range game. But so you do have to be aware of the deep shots. So you do maybe want to play off a little bit for that. But the thing I think you're most trying to prevent with them is the same thing that Ohio State does, which is catch a 5-yard pass and take it to the house. It wasn't on an RPO, but Evan Stewart, the former 5-star recruit who transferred from Texas A&M, who is one of Oregon's 3 best receivers, had a touchdown, I think last week, that looks exactly like the Jeremiah Smith triangle explosion, except it wasn't on an RPO. There wasn't like a read on it. Dylan Gabriel just took a 3-step drop and hit him. And the corner wasn't ready. The safety came down too much, and the guy caught it in stride and was gone for 70 yards. And it is the West Coast version of Jeremiah Smith. So you can't have that. So I guess my question, Landis, is if that would be first in their passing game, they're going to dink and dunk you, but that's the number one scary thing, more than the deep ball. How do you stop that? Is that with tight coverage? We're going to be on top of them on the slant, or is it, let's make sure we're not so aggressive that a 4-yard pass turns into a 70-yard touchdown? What's the best way to stop those plays?
I mean, not to give you a boring answer. It's probably some mix of both. I guess the thing that playing aggressively and pressing in those situations gives you is throwing off the timing. Like Oregon's offense is very much a timing-based offense. Dylan Gabriel wants to catch a snap and get the ball out as quickly as possible, get it into space and let those guys run, and then help like have perimeter blocks set up to go with that. So, if you jam a guy at the line and he's half a second slow into how that play is supposed to be timed, then you've thrown the playoff. So I guess from that standpoint, you want to maybe be more aggressive than not, but then you run, like, if you're doing that and everyone's super sticky to their guy and the guy who has the ball slips one tackle, well, then like who's there, right? Who else is there to make that tackle? So that's probably the balance that Jim Knowles going through right now. So I think you'll see them do both. I think, like I said, I think you'll see them be more aggressive in this game than they have in any of the other games, but I don't know if it's going to be full throttle the entire time because, to your point, giving up big plays is not just having the ball thrown over your head. It's missing one tackle and a guy that catches the ball 3 yards down the field runs for 75, right? It is interesting watching Oregon and Ohio State. These offenses are pretty similar in how they want to attack teams. I think Ohio State has been far more precise at it than Oregon has so far this year, but run the ball, mix in a little quarterback run. Maybe the quarterback throwing the ball down the field is not the best thing the offense does, but they can get the ball on the perimeter and they terrify you with run after the catch. It is like practically identical methodologies. Like the run games are a little different, and some of the play calls and shifts and all that stuff are a little different. But the idea of just like get it out quick on the perimeter, we got dudes out there. Like that is also what Ohio State wants to do. So it's a very fascinating matchup.
And yes, that is true. I don't need to expand for 9 more minutes on that point because it is a great point. The other thing I think is true fundamentally for this discussion for Ohio State fans is part of the desire for press man is because that's what they did in the Urban era. That's what they did with Kerry Combs, the cornerbacks coach. That's what they did with Marshawn Lattimore and Denzel Ward and Garyon Conley and Jeff Okudah and Damon Arnett. And we're going to get up in your grill and we're going to challenge you one-on-one and go ahead and beat us. But the thing they had that tied to that was we're also going to have a maniac in your quarterback's face. So when we're pressed up, that quarterback is not going to have time to wait for a route to develop. And he's going to think to himself, I have a Bosa or Chase Young trying to kill me. I've got to get the ball out. And then when he tries to get the ball out, there's a first-round corner wrapped around his receiver. Mm-hmm. When you don't have the Bosas and Chase Young, you can't play as aggressively, I think, in coverage. And so the line is playing well, but it's still not that. Don't you think that's part of it, Bill? Now, the one thing about this game is Oregon's going to get the ball out quick, not because they're forced to, but because they want to. It's almost like they are their own Chase Young, that they have a clock in their head that's Chase Young. So it might be a reason to press up with these guys because, as you said, it throws off the timing. But I have to think that's part of the equation. If they had the best sack guys in the country, maybe they'd play more press man, Ohio State.
They certainly work hand in hand. Ohio State does lead the country in pressure rate. Like it's not, and they do it without blitzing. So like I think yes, you're right, but I also think that maybe they are getting after it up front the way they need to run that. Like their pressure rate this year is better than their pressure rate the year they had Chase Young. Now pressuring the quarterback and hitting the quarterback. Saying do it.
Then you're saying you're getting the pressure, so play press man.
Yeah, more. Yeah. I think pressuring the quarterback and hitting the quarterback are two different things. To the point of one of the questions you asked. And Ohio State could probably be hitting the quarterback more, and it certainly hit the quarterback more when it had Chase Young. But in terms of just like getting in his face, like I think they're doing that okay. My view on this has actually been sort of the reverse. Like I've heard people being upset a little bit about the lack of pass rush production, and I actually think it's because Ohio State's playing too soft. If Ohio State were playing press man, I think Ohio State would have more sacks because I do think the defensive line is winning mostly at the clip you'd like to see it win. Like I don't know what to make of the fact that they're leading the country in pass and pressure. Like that's a fact. So that to me says they've been pretty good. And it's not like they were awesome in one game and been bad the others. They've been pretty consistent with it. They were great last week against Iowa. So I actually think the key to unlocking more of that pressure and hitting Dylan Gabriel is less about what the D-line is doing and more about how Jim Knowles is calling coverages.
Okay. That was a good, hearty 12-minute discussion about that's good ball. God, it's great to have a great game, isn't it? This is Taz. Is Oregon the Penn State of the West? Coaches with some questions, recruiting, big game performance, whatever. Sort of runs through the list, like comparing Drew Aller and Dylan Gabriel. Questionable team performance early in the year versus Boise State and Bowling Green. I don't think that's exactly quite the same thing. Maybe a lot of smoke, but no real hot, burning, sustainable wildfire taking college landscape by storm. So I think it is a super fascinating question. I think Oregon is a cut above the traditional Penn State, partly because I think Dan Lanning gets after it in a way that James Franklin maybe just the way they coach. Now, Dan Lanning is not does not have a great record in big games. He lost to Washington twice last year. He's 18-0 against unranked teams and 7-5 against ranked teams at Oregon. So, I mean, of course, you're not as good against ranked teams, but he has a lot of the same questions, which is everyone's going to talk about, that Ryan Day does. I would advise Ohio State fans to not go into this game thinking of Oregon as the Penn State team that Ohio State has dominated in the last 10 years, losing only once. I do think Oregon is better than that, and that's all that matters here. We're just talking to Ohio State fans. So my advice is, I get the comparison, but I do think this Oregon team is better and more prepared, I think, schematically and probably emotionally to take on Ohio State in a big game, even though Penn State's played Ohio State really close in a couple of those games.
I actually really like the comparison.
Okay.
I like, from a talent standpoint, just like player to player, I think it's probably close. Like, Oregon's not trotting out Georgia's roster, right? I think it is closer to a Penn State roster. I think what you're saying schematically, especially about Oregon's offense, is true of Penn State teams of the past, but maybe not as true about this current version of Penn State, right? Sure. But I do think that Dan Lanning manages a game much more aggressively than James Franklin does, for better or for worse, right? But like,
he's lost some games because of it.
He's lost games because of it, but I think the fair criticism of James Franklin in the big games that he's played is that it's felt like he's trying like not to lose, and Dan Lanning, whether it works or not, is going to try to win. So Ohio State will have to match that, I think, in this game against Oregon in a way that I don't think it has to match that when it plays Penn State, or at least it hasn't had to match that when it's played Penn State. So that to me is a pretty stark difference between the two. But in terms of like program vibes and players and stuff like that, I think it's a pretty solid comparison.
I mean, we talked about in the preseason that the four best teams in the country were Georgia, Texas, Ohio State, and Oregon, and we've never had that conversation about Penn State. Now,
yeah, but that's because Oregon hasn't had the opportunity to not live up to those expectations yet, while Penn State has.
That's interesting. Because here's the thing: what defines Ohio State? Now, excuse me, what defines Penn State? What is the defining characteristic of a negative, I'm not that scared of you idea about Penn State? It's losing to Ohio State. Mm-hmm. So Oregon has not had that chance, although they did come in the horseshoe and win 3 years ago without their best player. So anyway, but
that's true.
In a game that James Franklin has never come close. Like, anyway. But yeah, no, because that's a whole. You are defined by your biggest games, and by definition, Penn State's biggest games are against Ohio State, and they don't win them.
Yeah.
So Oregon, we'll see, and again, like what this Ohio State-Oregon rivalry may become. They don't play next year, but in the year after that, Oregon's in Columbus, and the year after that, Ohio State's back in Oregon. So they're going to play 3 of the first 4 years that they're in the Big Ten. So, and this is like a companion thing. Just again, I think it's reasonable to be like, what's up with Oregon? This is from the 314 MH. What's the overall deal with Oregon? They lost twice to Washington last year, and Lanning hasn't won a super big game. Gabriel is a 2-time transfer and tiny. I'm not sure I really understand the love and hoopla. Can you help with it? Guess maybe they just have duck mentality. It's Matt and Mo. I guess that's Matt in Missouri. So there's skill.
There's an aura about Oregon, isn't there? Like, it's because of Chip Kelly. It's like everyone thinks that Oregon is still Chip Kelly's Oregon, which like they just feel inherently dangerous. And I'm not saying they're not. Like Oregon's a good team, but it does seem to always kind of carry that mystique about it because, like, I don't know, it's tucked away in the corner in the Pacific Northwest. People don't get to see him a whole lot. And now, like, Dan Lanning's there, and he's like kind of a heel, and they got a lot of NIL money, and it's like, yeah, this team's going to be something I think to reckon with in college football, which like I think they kind of haven't earned yet, but people talk about them that way.
I think probably 3 of the 4 biggest things about Oregon, have nothing to do with this year's team, really, which is uniforms, Nike, Chip Kelly, and Dan Lanning yelling at Dion.
Yeah.
So how does that affect the ball? I mean, I do think we see it in the fact that Dylan Gabriel was the preseason Heisman favorite, and it's like, well, like, why? He was the preseason Heisman favorite like you would expect of being the quarterback at a blue blood. And it's like,
Right.
well, I mean, he's good, but I don't think he's not like, oh, you don't watch him and think that's the best player in the country. But I mean, I would advise not underestimating Oregon. I don't think Ohio State fans should go in this game being like, they're kind of a fraud. They're a little puffed up. I actually don't think that's the case, even though there might be 10 reasons to think it. I think individually you can pick apart Oregon. It's like plucking feathers off a duck. Like you pluck a feather off and you're like, I don't know, it's just a feather. And you're plucking it and plucking it and plucking it. And all of a sudden you have a naked duck and you're just looking at a naked duck. And it's like, what is this? I'm scared of this. And then the duck bites you right in the butt. And it's like, okay, I get it. That still hurt. So I think you can pick Oregon apart, but when you put all the pieces together, they're pretty balanced. They have a plan. Their head coach, I think, is competent and aggressive, and they have worked the portal like a maniac. You start going through, and it's like, if I was going to say, I was trying to think, like, I think there's maybe like 9 really good Oregon players, and like 7 of them are transfers.
Yeah.
So, yeah, and now they're recruiting better now, but this is not a team, because Lanning's only in year 3. This is not a team built on Dan Lanning's great recruiting. It's like Jabbar Muhammad came from Washington, and Kobe Savage came from Kansas State, and Evan Stewart came from Texas A&M, and Dylan Gabriel came from Oklahoma. And like you run through everything, and it's like there's some
Johnson's a transfer. Yeah,
there's some high level guys who are transfers. So keep that in mind. Jordan Birch came from South Carolina. Like Derek Harmon came from Michigan State. Jamari Caldwell came from Houston. Literally 8 of their 10 best players are transfers in the last 2 years. But that actually is a plus for them, because it's like, oh, well, what is Oregon? It's like, actually, they're a program that with the Nike money has worked NIL and the transfer portal in a way to bring in a lot of really good veteran players.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing that I would come back to if you're thinking like, I sense like a little bit of like Oregon fatigue, because people are just tired of hearing about a team that hasn't done a whole lot just yet. But
yeah,
every player you just mentioned is going to play in the NFL, right? Like of the guys who were in the starting 22 for Oregon, without actually going and counting them up, I'd say probably 15 of them are going to play in the NFL, right? It's the same. It's Ohio State's roster is better, but this is a very good roster that Oregon has. So whatever you might think of the way the program is talked about or what it has earned or hasn't earned, the talent is the talent. They're a good team.
Yeah. All right, we got to go faster. I apologize. This is Avery. If Jeremiah Smith has a big game, 2 touchdowns and 100 plus yards, what are the odds he makes it into serious Heisman conversations? What do you think, Landis?
He's got a shot. Yeah, I think he would have a shot. If he's scored in every game, I think he's been close to or maybe over 100 yards of total production in every game he's played. If that persists and he has a monster game like this, he is the highlight every week for Ohio State. Like I think I said this in week 1. If you're perusing other college football games and they go to a game break to show you Ohio State, they're showing you Jeremiah Smith. So like he is in front of a lot of people and will continue to be. So I think he'd have a really good shot at it, because I don't know the front runners for the Heisman now are like Ashton Genty and Travis Hunter, who I'm not entirely convinced people will really wrap their arms around as viable candidates when the time comes, even though I think they should. So if a guy like Jeremiah Smith at a place like Ohio State starts to do some of the stuff that's mentioned in that question, I think he's got a real shot.
I think they will wrap their arms around those guys, and Cam Ward from Miami, I think, will come back to the pack. But I think what we talked about all offseason, who's Ohio State's Heisman candidate?
Mm-hmm.
And we said, well, the running backs are going to split duty. We don't really think it's going to be Will Howard. We sort of arrived at Caleb Downs, and I think Jeremiah Smith is Ohio State's Heisman candidate. So then if the conversation is Ohio State beats Oregon, Ohio State's the 1 or 2 team in the country, who's their Heisman candidate? Are we already there with that? Is Jeremiah Smith Ohio State's best Heisman candidate? He's their leading receiver.
Yeah, by a very small margin in terms of yardage over Emeka Egbuka. Emeka has more catches and 1 fewer touchdown. They're basically even in production. Yes, I would say it's Jeremiah, but I think Emeka Egbuka is like close on his heels. If you had to pick a Heisman candidate for this team,
no offense, nobody's going to vote for Emeka Egbuka. Because like,
what if Emeka Egbuka had 3 touchdowns against Iowa, has 3 touchdowns against Oregon, and one of them's a rushing touchdown, and like he has 8 catches for 130 yards. He's in a game where people were talking about the receivers the whole time.
I think he's just the best. He's like a Biletnikoff candidate. It's hard for receivers to win the Heisman. It's hard for receivers to get there. I mean, I guess he could be Amari Cooper. I guess he's that, but you need to capture the imagination a little bit. And this is not, this part of the conversation is not about how good you are or how important you are. It's how you capture the imagination of voters. And so it's an interesting conversation. And the thing that is the issue for Ohio State is whether they reach the Georgia zone of like, hey, best team in the country, 9 good players, none of them Heisman candidates because they're all the same and they're all too good. And now all of a sudden, Georgia's the 2-time national champ, and they're not sending anybody to New York because you don't know what you're supposed to do. So I think in that clump, it's like, what do we do? It's like, well, have you seen the teenager with the one-handed grabs? So, fun conversation. Faster still. Who has the better offensive line? Andy and Ari said yesterday it was Oregon, and they seem to not hesitate, and we're pretty sure about that. That's Jimmy. And then this is Steve. Is the Oregon defensive line? Oh, wait. I think it's the Oregon. Oh, no, that was a defensive line question. I apologize. I read it wrong. So this is not like, this is why we wait to do like our preview shows and stuff. We don't do it on Monday because like we dig in on stuff. I spent 6 hours researching this, Landis. How long did you spend on researching Ohio State, Oregon?
About 5 hours last night. Yeah.
So listen to us. That's all I'm telling you.
Like, and also, we've been watching both teams pretty closely all year.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's just what we're trying to do with 28 Northern teams and an Ohio State show is this is the biggest game of the regular season for us, for what we do. And we're doing it on Wednesday. We're not doing it on Monday. Like, just listen. I like bringing in what other people say. Like, for this game, this conversation, don't listen to anybody else.
Yeah.
I'm not saying we're necessarily like the smartest football minds, but we care the most about this game, and we've put the most into researching this game. So, I don't know. Who do you think?
Is the question about offensive line or defensive line?
Better offensive line. Offensive line versus offensive line. Who's better?
I think Ohio State's is slightly better. I think Oregon's tackles are very good. I don't know that the interior is that good.
So, because the tackles, so we talked a lot about the tackles in the preseason. Josh Connolly and Johnny Cornelius, we thought for Oregon were maybe as good of a pairing as there was in the country, right? LSU has a guy, Texas has a guy, we get it, but the best pairing. But we talked a lot on Kings of the North the first 2 weeks that Oregon's offensive line was struggling, and we talked a lot about the interior of the offensive line for that. But then really, the tackles were also struggling. There was a play early in the Boise State game where Josh Connolly tried to cut an edge rusher and whiffed on him, and Dylan Gabriel got slaughtered on a sack. And it was like, that was horrendous. I have no idea what that was. And when we had Tyson Alger on, an really good Oregon writer last week on KOTN, he was talking about like he thought early in the year the tackles were a problem too. I do think Johnny Cornelius is the best offensive lineman in this game, their right tackle. If we were doing a draft of the 10 offensive linemen, would you take him first?
That is an excellent question. I might take Josh Simmons first.
Okay. So if the Oregon tackles aren't setting the world on fire, before the season, you would have said Oregon's offensive line for sure. Oregon had super struggles the first 2 weeks. It does feel like they've really gotten a lot of it together and they're playing much better. But Ohio State's offensive line has been playing better over the entire course of the season. I think it is a coin flip. And I think to say, no doubt about it, Oregon has the better offensive line is wrong based on the way they've played this year.
Yeah, that to me is just you just haven't watched Ohio State. So which is fine, but just like don't say things definitively you don't know anything about. I think it is probably
that was directed at somebody.
Yeah, I think it is I think it's a coin flip probably. Yeah. I guess the one thing I would say, if you wanted to give the edge to Oregon, which again I don't think that I would collectively, is who has the weakest link sort of to pick on, and I think it could be Ohio State with Josh Fryer in this game.
There are some Fryer questions. Okay, keep that energy. We'll see if we get to the Fryer questions. Keep that energy. Scott, is there one thing that Oregon does that really makes Ohio State nervous, or is it just one of those games where both teams are good and Ohio State needs to just not play like crap? My instinct is that Oregon is a very competent, talented team on both sides of the ball, and that is the biggest issue. If I was going to say one thing, I do think it is the Oregon interior pressure. I think Derek Harmon, watching Oregon, I rewatched the entire Boise State game and the entire Michigan State game. Derek Harmon, the Michigan State transfer, who leads in defensive tackles in the nation and pressures, it is unbelievable how disruptive he is. He is constantly in the backfield.
Yeah.
Whether it's blowing up run plays or getting after the quarterback, he is playing at an incredibly high level. And if he gets singled, he just wins with his hands immediately. I would say like Tegra Shabola, Seth McLaughlin, like that is my, not that they can't, but the guy is to me, that's the guy that's like, oh man, if you're Ohio State, you don't want that guy to blow up the game.
Yeah, he's played well against Ohio State in the past, I think, when he was at Michigan State. So the staff is familiar with him. The players, I guess, less so because Tager's new and Seth McLaughlin's new. I think Seth played really well. I would have Seth McLaughlin pretty high up in the Remington conversation right now, based off how he's played for Ohio State. So I'm less worried about him. Like Tegra Shabola as a young guy on the road against this interior, because Jamari Caldwell's really good too on the interior.
Yep.
Like that's a spot to watch, I think. Donovan Jackson has played well. He didn't have his best game against Iowa, but he's played well this year. So it's not like Ohio State's lacking for talent on the interior either. But that's a spot. I still don't know if that. I think stuff off the edge might concern me a little more than stuff up in the interior.
Birch was the Big Ten Defensive Player of the Week last week. He had 2.5 sacks. Jordan Birch, their best rush end. He can go through you or around you, right? He has enough
290 pounds. Yeah.
Enough speed, enough bend to get around the edge, but also really physical. And again, just like the way Oregon plays, they have 3 down linemen and then like a guy that they call an outside linebacker, who is usually Mateo Uiagalelei, DJ's brother that Ohio State recruited as like a stand-up linebacker on the other edge. So they often, I mean, like they don't ever have 4 guys, almost never had, they don't have 4 guys with their hands on the ground. So,
no. Yeah, but they will switch between like odd fronts and 4 guys on the line, even if one of them is standing up. So it'll mess with the like Ohio State's identifying stuff at times.
Yeah, no, I do, and their linebackers run to the ball pretty well. I do. It's more comprehensive to me for Oregon. That I don't know that there's a huge weak spot for Oregon. What's Oregon's weak spot? Do you think? Is it their interior offensive line?
Like for the team, I would say I would probably go there first. Yeah, I don't. Ayapani Lalaulu, who is their center, has played pretty well since they moved him to center. I think it was like in the Oregon State game.
Yeah.
But they're playing a guy at left guard who they weren't anticipating playing this year, Nishad Strother. I don't know that the guards are great. I think they're fine. So that is, I think, and like you're talking about blocking Tyleik Williams and Ty Hamilton, like that to me, I think if I'm comparing the matchups, I might be more worried about Tyleik Williams against those guys than I would be Derek Harmon against Ohio State's interior offensive line.
And this, I think, is correct for as you're going to watch this game as an Ohio State fan. Watch the interior offensive line play. I really think like the temptation is like Evan Stewart, Tez Johnson, Emeka Buka, Jeremiah Smith, Jordan James, the Oregon running back, Quinshon Judkins, and Trayvon Henderson. Watch the battle in the middle of the offensive line versus the defensive tackles. I actually think it's the determining factor in the game.
Yeah,
and
there's going to be some real battles between Tyleik Williams and Ayapani Lalaulu. That dude is a monster, and we know that Tyleik is.
And I think Tyleik Williams and Derek Harmon might be the 2 most disruptive interior defensive linemen in the country.
They're up there. As we're having this conversation, I'm reminded. We talked to Chip Kelly on Tuesday, and one of the early questions to Chip was like, so what stands out, or like, what do you think of Oregon's defense? And the first thing he said was Jordan Birch. Okay. So it wasn't like they do this or this or this, or they have early talent. It was like one guy, it was Jordan Birch. And maybe he had just watched the Michigan State film where Jordan Birch had 2.5 sacks, but he is a guy with defensive tackle size who moves like a defensive end, I think is how Ryan Day described him. So that's
they dropped him in coverage on one play. Where I can't remember which team it was trying to just like flip a little throw to a running back, And the play call was have the edge guy drop out and cover. And like he went out and covered the guy like he was glue, and the pass hit him in the chest and he should have had a pick. And he's 290 pounds. So he's really good. But I think Harmon and Birch are both like major difference makers on that Oregon defensive line.
I agree.
We got to go faster. Shelby, our guy, prepping for Hurricane Milton here in Fort Myers, Florida. Best of luck to all our viewers and listeners dealing with this hurricane season. We need the pleasant distraction that we offer. Thank you. Well, we're happy to provide it, and everybody stay safe. Wondering if the trust that Ryan Day has in Chip Kelly will free Day up to have a more aggressive mindset Saturday. Safe or aggressive approach from Knowles is best. Which one's best? So, like, do you think that Ohio State's offense will get after it even a little bit more because Ryan Day thinks Chip can handle getting after it in a big game like this?
Yeah, probably. There have been a lot of questions to Ryan Day about him coaching more aggressively. And actually, the data I don't necessarily think supports that in terms of like how often they're going for it on fourth down. But I guess maybe I feel like Ryan Day has been more decisive about going for it on fourth down. There's been less like, I don't know what we should do kind of stuff. It's just like fourth down, we're going for it. So I think they are positioned to coach more aggressively. I just think Ryan Day has like a better has his finger on the pulse of the game a little more, right? We've talked about that a lot when he was calling plays, and it's like the what was it, the Michigan game in 2022 when they tried the fake punt thing that didn't work because they had the backup long snapper in there, and like CJ Stroud was like screaming to the sideline that just let him go for it on fourth down, and Ryan Day didn't do it. It's like I think now Ryan Day will probably let him do it because Ryan Day has his eyes up and he sees what's going on the field. So I think he'll coach more aggressively, and part of that too is what we talked about before, like Dan Lanning will. So I think Ryan Day will match that, or Ryan Day might try to set the tone more than Dan Lanning does. We'll see, but I do think it'll be more aggressive.
I also think it's possible any aggression that people sense from Ryan Day is entirely tied to the fact that he believes in this run game 10 times more than he's believed in the run game in the past. Mm-hmm. And that like 4th and 3, we can get that. And that even it doesn't mean they're necessarily going to run, but their run game is enough of a threat. Like all the stuff we did, everything was short yardage. They can't get short yardage and red zone stuff with the run game for 3 years. And that is gone. And I know Will Howard got stopped on a 4th and 2, but that's gone. And so I think that was a weight on him. So obviously Chip Kelly is a huge part of that, but it's also the offensive line playing well. It's also 2 backs who get downhill and hammer the ball. And I think that is what a way. There's no better way for it's the whole. You know what he's not talking about? Is he talking about like we need to be tougher?
Not really. He very briefly mentioned it after the Iowa game. He said like we knew we were going to get some feedback on like how tough and physical we can play in this game, but that's like kind of the extent to which he's really discussed that this year. Because
it's there. He doesn't have to talk about it.
Yeah.
So I think that makes you aggressive when you have belief, and I think there's a lot there. This is what comes up all the time with big games, and I get it from Tim. Do you think they've been holding back a lot on offense and defense with this game circled a long time ago? Has that been, even with Michigan State and Iowa's Big Ten games, have they been saving stuff for the Ducks, do you think?
Yeah, I think so. I don't know quite what that'll look like on defense. Maybe some more like simulated pressure kind of stuff where like the ends drop out and somebody else blitzes. I think there's more pressure looks, I think, in general that Jim Knowles has not gotten into just yet that I think he will dial up in this game. And then on offense, I've been waiting for him to do 2-back stuff. They haven't done it yet. Chip Kelly did it a lot at UCLA. They certainly have the backfield to do it. So maybe he can dust that off in this game. But yeah, I think like there's a time in training camp, I think, where you give this game some thought and you start working on some stuff. And like even while Howard after the Iowa game was like, yeah, I watched a little bit of Oregon during the bye week. So like you certainly keep a thing or two in your back pocket. And I was what was I watching? Cover 3. They were talking about when Alabama played Georgia, Alabama came out and like ran empty, which it had like not done all year. And Kirby Smart said after the game, like, we weren't expecting that. And it took us a full half to figure out how to defend it. So I think there could be something like that on the table for Ohio State's offense. And like the same for Oregon too, right? They knew this game was coming as well. But as it pertains to Ohio State, I think, especially on offense, I'm looking for some 2-back stuff.
It was interesting that they had not run Will Howard that much. And Will Howard, I went through like every Will Howard run last week. It was 8 called runs, I think.
Yep.
Of the 10 that he had. And he'd averaged 2 called runs a game before that. So like that was a step. They could have saved that for this if they wanted to. Right? I mean, these ran like QB power 3 or 4 times. Out of empty.
Mm-hmm. I think that's also, that could be the kind of thing where you show it the game before the game so that the other team is preparing for it, and then maybe you don't do it, and it's like, well, we wasted 20 minutes of practice time trying to defend something we're not going to see.
Or then you have the alternate off of that where now you've set up the empty QB power. Will Howard starts to run, stops, takes a deep shot.
Yeah.
Troy Smith used to do that. Thomas. When Ohio State wins and wins convincingly, what excuse will be made to describe Oregon as overhyped or not that good? If Ohio State wins, how many spots do they drop? If they lose, will they drop completely out of the top 10? So I think it's what you had said before, Bill, or what people had sort of suggested is, well, Ohio State just physically overmatched them. Actually, Oregon is not physically the same type of opponent that you would get with Georgia or Texas or Alabama. So Ohio State just overwhelmed them, and we have to keep that in mind when we think about Oregon. Even though, again, like I actually don't think that's true, but I'm trying to think like what's the reason that people downplay an Ohio State win?
They would downgrade Dylan Gabriel probably and say he's not that good.
He's just old.
He's just an old guy who's been hanging around for a long time. I don't know. I mean, Dan Lanning can't win big games, so of course Ohio State beat him, kind of thing. It's like, the same. Yeah. It's not dissimilar from some of the dialogue coming out of some of Ohio State's wins against Penn State. It's like, that had nothing to do with Ohio State. That was all Penn State. So it could be a similar conversation here. It won't happen with us, but I think you could hear it elsewhere.
Yeah, that whole idea that Ohio State can't win big games because somehow beating Penn State when they're in the top 10 is never viewed as a big game by anybody.
Yeah. Right.
Like, okay, I don't, and that's some of you. I'm talking to you, the diehard Ohio State fans who brush off beating number 8 Penn State. It's like, okay, I guess if you want to play that game, I don't think anybody watching or listening to this will brush off an Oregon win. 3 in the country. I don't know. I hope not. That is just a terrible way. If you lose, it's disaster. If you win, it's no big deal. How is that a way to go through life? That is nothing. Don't do that to yourself or allow anyone else to do it to you. This is Derry S., who asked a bunch of great questions. Was there anything you saw from Boise State's plan of attack that you think Ohio State can replicate? And I think my main thing would be play like Ashton Genty.
Yeah, that's probably it, right? Like, but I think Quinshon Judkins and Travion Henderson can play like Ashton Genty, right? So just run it at them. I think that's if you look at Oregon's, obviously Boise ran the ball really well on them. And then since then it has kind of progressively gotten better, Oregon's run defense. And I guess it means a little something against Oregon State, although I don't think it means quite as much as people might want to give it credit for. And then it's like UCLA and Michigan State. Like, I do not think that Oregon has magically solved its run defense issues, or I'd at least like them to prove it. So I think that's it. It's like, go run the ball at them the same way Boise did and make them prove that they can stop it.
There's a chunk. Boise probably should have won that game. There's a chunk of that game that's just really 2 things in my mind. One is the Oregon interior offensive line on the other side of the ball was about as, I don't know that I've ever seen a good team have a single issue kill them as much as their interior offensive line play killed them in the first 2 games of the year. Mm-hmm. Like they even had a play where Dylan Gabriel fumbled the ball because the center snapped the ball too early and he wasn't expecting it and nobody moved. And he was like, I guess I'll run. And then he got hit and fumbled. And literally the offensive line was still in their stance. And it was like, what was that? That was insane.
They almost lost to Idaho because they couldn't block Idaho. If you look at like the pressures allowed by game, it's like they've allowed like 4 of the last 3 games and they allowed like 15 to Idaho.
They couldn't block anybody. So like that, like if you watch the first 2 games, you're like, I think Ohio State's going to win by 50, but they really have fixed that quite a bit. Yeah. Now, is it good or just better than awful? I don't know. But then Genty, there's a chunk of the Boise game that is just, that's the best running back in the country. He had a play where he got hit in the back, 3 yards in the backfield by Jamari Caldwell and broke the tackle and ran for 35 yards. Like, well, that was good defense, actually. And then that monster Ate them alive. Now, and the other thing that you have to keep in mind as we think about that Boise plan. So I do think it's get downhill and run at them, right? That's what you learned from that Boise plan. The second half of the Boise game, Oregon had 2 returns for touchdowns. They had a punt return and a kick return for a touchdown. And they also had 2 turnovers. The Oregon defense was on the field the entire second half. Boise had like 75 offensive plays. The defense was exhausted. And when the Oregon defense was exhausted, Boise ran on them. Now, like in the third quarter, actually, they held up for a little while. Genty ran on them early. They had a decent plan in the third quarter, and then they were exhausted at the end. So there is some stuff there that's not applicable because it was like Oregon was doing good things and bad things to make the time of possession get completely out of whack, and they were playing the best running back in the country. So don't go too far with the Boise comparison, but I would take run Quinshon Judkins at him and Travion Henderson until they prove they can tackle him.
Yeah.
And it's downhill, downhill, downhill.
Mm-hmm. You also reminded me of something there, just talking about like sheer volume of plays. To go back to the question about what could be different in this game, I was surprised to see that Oregon is 79th in pace of play and Ohio State is 89th in pace of play. I think both might throttle that up.
Okay. Interesting. Okay. But I think they both have to right. You got to get a first down, and then you can get tempo and run the ball. And again, like I think there's going to be some guys trying to stop them from running the ball. Mm-hmm. They're just really, really similar. Steven asks, based on what I saw against Michigan State, Ohio State would beat Oregon by 28. I don't think physically these programs are the same at all. I don't know if I agree with that, Bill. Do you think
I disagree with? I think Oregon's offensive line is pretty physical. And I think their defensive line is pretty physical. So like if you want to say there's differences maybe in the second levels, I might agree with that. But in the fronts, I don't know that I agree with that.
I think the secondaries are similar. I think the receivers are similar. I think Evan Stewart's like he's not Jeremiah Smith, but he's like a pretty good specimen along with having good hands and that kind of thing. Yeah. That's not how I see it. And that Michigan State game got a little goofy. Dylan Gabriel's thrown 3 picks in the red zone the last 2 games. If he does that, Ohio State's going to win for sure. So Dylan Gabriel has been a nut.
Yeah, I think maybe a physical advantage could show itself on the perimeter for Ohio State. I think with aside from Evan Stewart, like Oregon's receivers are kind of small. I haven't been super impressed with their perimeter blocking in general. Ohio State's perimeter blocking has been excellent on offense, and I could just see like Jordan Hancock, Davis Igbenogson, and Denzel Burke kind of like ragdolling receivers, or Caleb Downs, and like they're making plays on the edge that other teams haven't made because Ohio State is more physical there. But like in the trenches, I don't know. It feels kind of even to me.
I think the way Ohio State dominates is they just get downhill in the run game all night, and Oregon never stops it. And then when Oregon tries to answer, they're running a quick passing game. And on 3rd and 3, they try a little quick hitter, and Davis Igbenogson is draped all over the guy, and it's incomplete, and they're punting. Like that's the when they need the quick passing game to keep up, the physicality of the Ohio State corners rises up, and they never really stop the Ohio State run game. That's the nightmare scenario, I think, for Oregon, which is on the table.
Yeah, I think so. Oregon has run the ball better. Like Jordan James. Jordan James is actually good. Yeah, he's been like cumulatively pretty good this year. Then he had a bit of a breakout game against Michigan State. So like that seems to be rounding into form a little bit. Their rushing attack. They don't have 2 backs like Ohio State does. Jordan James is like clearly the number 1, and Noah Whittington gets some carries, but I think it's like 2/3 of the carries go to Jordan James. Yeah, but he played well last week. He's played pretty well all year.
He's trying to get you on the edge, though, right? He's trying to bounce. He's trying to run wide.
A lot of like, a lot of pistol, like outside zone kind of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So this is sort of related to the reality of a 12-team playoff and how we are encouraging, I think is the right word, people to try to take in their team. I got a couple here. Steve, I'm trying to take the Doug approach and just enjoy a potentially great game. It will be hard to relax, however. I know I'll be nervous, pacing, and screaming in the end. So we appreciate Steve like trying, right? Like try. This is TF. Said, I just texted a buddy earlier when listening to Day's presser, and I said the nerves were already kicking in. We don't get that many of these types of games, so it's exciting. Like, how great is that, right? The nerves, I think nerves should be kicking in, but not fear and not dread. Nerves, yes. Dread, no. In the 12-team playoff era.
Yeah.
I just want to share a few thoughts about this game in the season so far. This is our guy, Josh Mustachio. This 12-team playoffs helped me out and let me enjoy more of the season. I expect Ohio State to win, but if they don't, it won't kill the rest of the year for me. In the past, 7-0 versus Iowa at the half would have had me stressed way more than I needed to be. You've got me thinking differently when you started saying one loss should not ruin a season a few years ago. I say this to all Ohio State fans, win or lose, this game will make us better for down the road, and that should be the goal in the end. Not lose now and the season is almost over. A new era, a new attitude, go Bucks. I don't think Josh is the only person feeling that. This is Luke, our guy, Luke H. I'm so excited to just enjoy the game. In other iterations of Ohio State football seasons, big games against tough teams come with high anxiety and a looming sense of dread because of the fact that if they lose them, their chances of winning a championship are likely over or on life support. So now I can just watch and enjoy the game. Sure, I'll be annoyed, frustrated, and bummed if they lose, but I won't be feeling the weight of doom and gloom that comes with losing a big game in the BCS or 14 playoff era. I'm just happy and excited. Bill, the playoff has saved our people. I'm so happy.
I like that last one. I think, like, I don't want, as someone who still gets a little maniacal about the sports teams that he likes, like, I don't want people like popping down on their couch to watch a game and just be like, well, if we lose, we lose, like, kind of thing, right? Like, I still, like, I don't want people to lose the desire to want to watch your team win and kind of thing. But I do think the dread is the part of it that I hope people can eliminate from their minds. So if people are feeling that, I'm happy about that.
I do think it's possible. I think the equation is possible where you enjoy the wins just as much and the losses ruin your day, week, and season 2/3 less, right? That if you were, I was 100.
Can a loss ruin your day, but not ruin your life? Like,
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And you don't have to like watch the Oregon. If Ohio State loses to Oregon, you don't have to be like, well, let's go get ice cream. That's okay. You don't have like that's, but also you maybe don't have to wake up Monday morning thinking to yourself, I can't believe it, like, because nothing's over. And so the thing that I think is the main thing that I think, and we'll get to a survey question here in a second, is watch less for results and more for performance. So what really matters is watching your team and watching them play in a way that makes you think, oh, they're good. Oh, they can do this. Oh, they can win big games. And if they don't win, I mean, it's just really, if you play well and lose, it's so much more acceptable in the 12-team playoff. Because if you play bad, like if you're Bama walking out of the Vanderbilt game, all right, it's like we're still having the playoff. It's like, yeah, but you got problems, bro. I don't know what to tell you. You have things that will hurt you again down the line. If Oregon and Ohio State both look awesome and one has to lose, that's really where the 12-team playoff should help people. So performance, yes. You can still feel anxiety after the fact over, we have a hole, or, we didn't show up. But if somebody hits a 49-yard field goal in the last play of the game to win a banger, somebody's got to lose.
Yeah.
Let's do a little survey stuff because people answered the surveys that I asked them, Landis. Ohio State is a 3-point favorite over Oregon. How do you think Saturday's game will go? What percent of the people said like they think Ohio State won't just win, but cover? They'll win by at least 4.
79%.
88%. Very confident. So
yes.
Ohio State will lose actually got more votes than Ohio State will win by less than 3 because it is hard to think of like, it's going to be 31-30. Yeah. So 7% said they would lose. 6% said they would win by 3 or less. So 93-7, our educated, dedicated, loyal Ohio State texters, 614-662-4509. If you want to sign up, think Ohio State is going to win. On a scale of 1 to 10, and I want to talk about this. I don't know that I have a question for it, but I know it was talked about. On a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you think Ohio State traveling 2,500 miles to Oregon will have an effect on the game? 10 is the travel matters a lot. 1 is the travel doesn't matter at all. What do you think the vote was on that, Bill?
I think the 4.
4.53.
Yeah.
What do you think? What do the Buckeyes think of that?
I think it is nearly a 0, and it seems like Ohio State does too. I know that Ryan Day was asked specifically, like, hey, teams are 1-8 in conference play when traveling across 2 time zones, which is true, but also only 2 of those were favorites losing, which was USC twice. I just don't think it's that big of a deal. Here's what I think is like more of a deal when we're talking about this stuff is that where do I have it here? Sorry. Oregon after this plays like at Purdue, back home, at Michigan, back home, at Wisconsin. Like if that were what's happening for Ohio State, I'd be concerned about it at some point along the way. As a one-off West Coast trip, I don't really think it matters all that much.
Our guy Brian is concerned about this. So Ohio State is traveling on Friday. What are the specifics that you know or that are known?
Yeah, they're doing their normal thing. So they have a walkthrough on Friday. I think maybe they're doing it a little earlier than they normally do. But they'll get out of town sometime on Friday afternoon. It's like a 4.5-hour flight to get to Eugene. So they'll get to Eugene. I don't know exactly what time they're leaving. So probably around dinner time, I think they'll get to Eugene.
So Brian is very concerned. If you travel on Friday, your body will be spending a ton of resources adjusting its circadian rhythms on Saturday. He's worried about it. He really thinks it's going to matter. You can't stay on East Coast time when you travel to the West Coast. Your body begins adjusting its circadian rhythm based on light exposure and temperature changes. This is honestly as criminal as the lost Jackson Smith and Jigba season. Like he is very concerned about this. I am absolutely thinking this has an effect. I think it has had an effect on games so far, and I think it will. The only time that I can remember in my
what's the effect besides the USC games? Like what were like USC losing at Michigan and USC losing at Minnesota, and even I would only say like the one like losing at Minnesota is the only one of those 2 that I would qualify as like actually like super surprising.
I don't know. I'm not saying it's based on facts. I'm just saying it's based on what I think. No, I don't. So, and it's not based on what the record has been. It's just based on, when's the last time, the only time that, to me that Ohio State has gone west and played a team this good in the regular season was USC in 2008, and they lost 35-3. And I don't think they lost 35-3 because they traveled to the West Coast. Like, that's not what I'm saying. But they also went early and had a walkthrough in the Coliseum on Friday. I just think that it is not the norm. Yes, they travel. They don't travel like this that often. And it's part of the whole package of the biggest game in Autzen Stadium history, pretty good home field advantage. They've never played there. And also, time zones do matter a little bit. And I can just already hear Ryan Day in the postgame saying, yeah, I think we were a little sluggish. Maybe it did affect us more than we realized. I just think they're not used to it. That's all. I don't know. I'm factoring it in. I am absolutely factoring it in. And it's not a body clock thing necessarily. It's just like you're on the plane for a long time. I don't know. I know he said like it's not that much farther than Nebraska and it's the new world and it's going to become normal. It's not normal yet. It's not. So maybe I'm crazy. I don't know. But I think the fact that this game is in Oregon affects my view of it somewhat substantially.
I mean, it affects my viewpoint too, because Autzen Stadium is a tough place to play. I'm not worried about the travel. Maybe I'm an idiot for not being worried about it, and I'll look like a fool after the game. But
I will.
What do NFL teams do when they fly East Coast to West Coast? They leave on Friday and spend a day there on Saturday. Or do they fly on Saturday and play on Sunday?
I don't know, but they're millionaires. They're men. They don't have to go to class. I don't know.
These guys.
I don't know what the answer is. Online. I don't. Isn't it great? So, okay, the travel is a 4.53 of what people think. So they also think it's low, right? They are not worried about it. I would vote like an 8 that I think it matters. Okay, here's like the rapid fire. Your confidence level, how much Ohio State needs to win, like the need it level for their own confidence, for their playoff resume, for just feeling good about themselves, and then the excitement level. All right, Landis? So excitement level, confidence level, need it level. What do you think is highest in the vote, 1 through 10?
Need it?
Excitement level is highest at a 9.06.
Okay.
Second is confidence level that Ohio State will win, 7.42. Third is need it level. And I said 10 is they really need to win. 1 is they'll be fine, win or lose, 5.95.
Interesting. Okay.
That is an excited, pretty confident, measured fan base. Yeah. That's my fan base. That's what I want for everybody. And if you think that if you're not a 9 on, how can your anxiety not be higher than your excitement and your confidence? I want my anxiety to be higher than every emotion at all times. What are we doing? Why? That's all the 12-team playoff is. We're just bringing down the anxiety level without losing the excitement level. I don't think this would be a 9.8 if it was a 4-team playoff. The excitement level doesn't go down, but the anxiety level does, Bill. It's math. We have the equation. The texters just told us it's a rousing success. Everybody go have fun. Try your best. It does matter. It absolutely matters. But it doesn't ruin stuff. Okay. How excited? We're whisper excited. Yay, it's going to be fun. Aren't you excited?
I feel like the college football playoff should be sponsored by Xanax now.
I know.
It's lowering everyone's anxiety.
It's like, so you sit down, right? You sit down, you have wings, you have your Dr. Pepper, you have a pizza, and you're like, oh, I'm so excited for this game. Boop, pop a Xanax, but I'm not anxious about it. I'm so excited. This is going the other way. This is William. Do you think a loss helps more than a win in the long run? And the point is that like Urban Meyer, when he won national championships in his career, like weren't undefeated national championships, like you have like a loss to sort of motivate people in the 12-team playoff era when these teams could meet as many as 3 times. Like I'm recalibrating expectations from a bygone era where one loss could tank an entire season. So that's William. That's to the extreme. Like a loss would be better than a win. I never subscribe to that. I hate silver linings. So I think I can hate silver linings, but also say like, well, winning is always better than losing. Winning is always better than losing. But winning doesn't have to ruin you. That's where I am. It's very possible they're going to see Oregon again. Would we potentially think that's like, oh, the loser will then have an edge in the rematch for some reason?
No, I don't think I'd feel. Yeah, I don't think I'd feel that way. Winning is always better than losing, and I don't want people. Even though I'm very happy that maybe the anxiety that we talked about is lessened, I also don't want you like preconditioning yourself to spin a loss before the game even happens.
So like we're on the couch together, and I'm handing out the Xanax to people. It's like, hey, have a Xanax with your Dr. Pepper. Everybody just chill. And then like in the middle of the first quarter when everybody's is chilled, you're looking around the room saying, this is too chill. You should be a little more worried than this. Hey, man. Oh, it's all good. 14-0 Oregon. We're good. It's like, no, this is wrong. So everybody needs to like recalibrate good, but find your balance. Yeah. But again, 9 excitement, 5.9 anxiety, I think is the right balance. The anxiety is not a 2.
Yeah, 6 is still pretty high.
Yeah. I just don't like it's when you're at like a 9 on the anxious scale. That's like when real life stuff is happening. Okay, This is. I wish I could get to all of them. We can't because we talk too much. Danny, for Bill, how has Josh Fryer fared against speed rushers so far this year? I remember 1 rep versus Marshall going very poorly, but curious what his overall success rate is. One of my keys to the game. You had mentioned Fryer earlier, and I said we're going to get to that. So where are you on Fryer?
I think he's just kind of the same guy he was last year, where speed worries me.
Okay,
and maybe that's not as much of a factor in this game. I don't think Jordan Birch and Mateo Uiagalelei are like the super nimble, speedy, athletic edges. They're kind of more win with power, I think, kind of edges. So maybe that's not worth getting too concerned about. But I just Josh Fryer is not the most fleet of foot right tackle in the world. And I still also have questions. I don't know that it's been tested a whole lot yet. I thought much of his struggles last year were less about individual talent or matchups at times and more about recognizing pressure and where it was coming from and communicating kind of stuff. So I think collectively the offensive line has communicated pretty well. Like they were handling stunts and twists and all that stuff against Iowa. I thought perhaps better than I've seen in a couple of years from Ohio State's offensive line. So that was encouraging, but this will just be a different test because it's a team doing all that stuff probably more frequently and doing it with better athletes. So I'm not saying, watch out for right tackle. It's going to lose Ohio State the game, but if there is a weak spot on what I think has been a pretty good offensive line, I think it is still right tackle.
And then Danny's question for me is Oregon the most SEC Northern team? Not in terms of talent, but in terms of puffery, outlandish expectations, loudness, and false bravado. All right, everybody gather around. I got to tell you what the deal is. The most SEC Northern team is Ohio State. So the whole thing is puffery, outsized expectations, talent, passion, all those things. But then, like, you slice off at least a little piece of the crazy. So there are parts of being like SEC-ish that are good. They just go too far. So saying Ohio State is the most SEC-like Northern team is not like automatically a knock. It's like, well, there's a lot there. Like you should care. You should have passion. You should be proud. You should have talent. You should think you're everybody else. You should talk the talk and often walk the walk. Oregon probably is second because then there's nobody else, right? Michigan is not SEC-like. Penn State is not SEC-like. Notre Dame is not SEC-like. Kansas State, like Dion, like Colorado, right? Like if they would back it up with a greater degree and like if they get the whole thing, if he stays for 10 years, that could be it. Like that could be the next one in terms of like puffing yourself up and driving other people nuts and being proud of who you are and your fan base is really passionate. But there's not anybody else in the conversation, Bill, I think, right? It's Ohio State and then either nobody or Ohio State and maybe Oregon or Ohio State and a Deion Sanders Colorado team if he sticks around.
Yeah, I would probably just say it's Ohio State and Oregon. I don't know that I put Colorado in there quite yet because Colorado doesn't get after it in recruiting the same way. Oregon certainly does, and I think Ohio State does too, right? So I think it's those two programs. Yeah.
All right, so let's do a last coaching thing here. I have a bunch of questions on this. This is, sorry, I missed who sent this. Oh, this is my bad. Dan Lanning and Ryan Day are both scrutinized by the media for not being able to make it over the hump. Day versus Michigan, Lanning versus Washington. On a scale of 1 to 10, how much pressure is on each of these head coaches to win this game? In other words, who needs to win this more? This is from Ty. Do you guys think this game will overall equate to Dan Lanning versus Ryan Day rather than the players on the field? I feel like both coaches are at the top of their field. And when we look back in a year or two, we will be talking more about the coaching matchup between these powerhouses rather than the weapons both have on the field. Let's talk about this one. It has been a long time since I thought Ohio State had the coaching advantage in a big game. This is from the 419, our guy, Diggy D. And then I remember in Doug's screaming voice, of course I do. They went from having Day babysitting they went from Day babysitting his staff to an entire staff of professionals. That's why he feels like this is why. It's like he's screaming like me. This is why he feels like Ohio State has a coaching matchup because they have more good coaches. And then the last one is this. On the Yahoo College Sports podcast, our guy Dan Wetzel, who is on the Tuesday KOTM with me, talked about Ryan Day's tense demeanor and seriousness. It seems like I've heard that as less of a stark reality this year compared to the past couple of years. What say you? That's from Nate. So let's talk about first Day's demeanor, and then we'll talk about the coaching matchup a little bit. What did you think of Day's demeanor on Tuesday?
It felt a little different to me than his demeanor going into some past big games. When I have felt at times like he was tense in a way that worried me about Ohio State perhaps reflecting that with its play. It's not like he was, loosey goosey and telling jokes during his press conference, but he's been like short with his answers, and I think like at times like seemingly distracted when doing the Tuesday press conference ahead of games like this. And I didn't really pick up on that at all. He was even entertaining some stuff about like Chip Kelly at Oregon and like their relationship and being pretty expansive with his answers. So I think just generally for this season, now they haven't had a game of this magnitude yet, but I think the fact that he is more in tune with his roster has allowed him to present a little differently. So every coach is tense and a maniac, but I guess maybe that's a little less palpable with Ryan Day this year.
So then when it comes to the coaching matchup, who needs it more? I mean, I think part of the conversation is like, well, it's not do or die necessarily for anybody. I think both teams need to play well. So I think you could spin it that Lanning needs it more because Oregon's at home. And this is not Ohio State's biggest. Is it Ohio State's biggest game? I mean, it's not. Ohio State has to beat Michigan. That's their biggest game. And then depending what you think about Penn State and that that's at Beaver Stadium and that they have had a Big Ten rivalry with Penn State more, and that Lanning didn't beat Washington last year, I think you could justify saying Lanning needs it more. And I actually do I think top to bottom, I think I do like the coaching matchup for the Ohio State staff in this game, which is kind of what one of the texters was saying.
I think I like the matchup as well for Ohio State. I think Lanning needs it more. Lanning has a position in the sport that I don't think is entirely reflective of his resume.
Yeah. Because he yelled at Deion. He yelled at
Deion because he watched the tape and saw they sucked and they knew he could welcome the cameras into his locker room and yell at Deion. So I think he needs something like this, so kind of on that resume. Like Ryan Day, he has beaten Michigan, right? And like he's won big games like against Penn State. He's won a playoff game. He's coached in a national championship. They played a hell of a game against Georgia that everyone remembers. Like, I'm not saying that Ryan Day has a sterling record, but he has done some stuff, I think, to earn his position a little more than Dan Lanning has. So I feel like
the 2020 semifinal win against Clemson, the revenge game after all, Dan Lanning doesn't have anything close to that on his resume. Nothing. Now Ryan Day's in year 6 and Dan Lanning's in year 3, but like this would be the equivalent of that.
Yeah.
Like Ryan Day does have some. Dan Lanning almost, again, like 7-5 ranked teams. So I think they're both good. I will say this. So, and again, if Ohio State fans don't know this, and sorry we went long, I don't know. Do we all have to apologize for talking about your team, right? People like it. Don't they like it, Bill?
No.
They like it. So Dan Lanning's first offensive coordinator was Kenny Dillingham, and I think Kenny Dillingham half-lead Lanning. I think it's an exact comparison. So Dan Lanning is a defensive coach. He hires Kenny Dillingham. He's like, he was the co-OC at Florida State. He's there for 1 year, and he gets the head coaching job at Arizona State. And they hire Will Stein, who had been at UTSA, to be the offensive coordinator. And I don't know enough to have like a huge opinion on Will Stein, but I think people think Kenny Dillingham is really smart and really good. It's why he got the Arizona State job. He's like the youngest head coach in the FBS, and he left after 1 year, and he's the coordinator on the opposite side of the ball. So for Ohio State fans, you saw how good Jeff Hafley was in 2019 and how much Ohio State missed him when he was gone. I don't think like Will Stein is like, oh my God, the offense is not functional. But I think I don't know that people think Will Stein is one of the best offensive coordinators in college football. If they do, I apologize. And then Tosh Lupoy, who's the defensive coordinator, is really a recruiter. And it was weird. He was on Freddie Kitchen's staff with the Cleveland Browns for a year. And I was like, why is the guy who got famous for being a great recruiter at Alabama, like the Browns defensive line coach? I was like, so weird. But he's more recruiter than schemer. And so when you talk about like, for real, like in a game like this, Ohio State's 2 coordinators are old schemers who don't recruit. And Oregon's 2 coordinators, one's a recruiter and one's young. So I think there is potentially like a very large edge when it comes to scheming it up in a game like this for Ohio State.
I agree. I think you're right.
Okay. We agree on that. Sorry we couldn't get to everything. Too many good questions. Maybe I'll try to answer, Bill and I'll try to answer some of them on text the rest of the week. When we come back after the break, it's going to be what we said on the KOTN live big game breakdown. So again, we're just warning you, if you listen to both shows, it is the same thing, but we just want to make sure we bring it to both audiences. And it's just, we say the same stuff. So this is numbers. I got way into success rate, Landis. I am down the success rate rabbit hole on this stuff. And I'm going to be talking about, like, in the second quarter of the Boise State game on 2nd and 7, and I thought the left go, like, that's where we are in this stuff, right? You live in that world.
I live for breaking down these kind of games. And we got
Yes.
back-to-back games. How about that from Ohio State?
Yeah. So and we're definitely going to do Ohio State, Penn State. And we're probably we might have to do 9 big game breakdowns on KOTN the last week of the regular season, because there's going to be some bangers, but I think we'll probably do Ohio State, Michigan too. So anyway, but we'll at very least do it on this show, and we'll do Ohio State, Nebraska on this show for sure. And we might do Ohio State, Indiana on this show. So like, if you like the breakdowns, like we're going to be breaking it down, and Bill likes it, makes Bill happy. That's the thing. We want fans to be happy. We want Bill to be happy.
I appreciate it.
Yeah, that's what we're here for. All right. After the break, the big game breakdown. Ohio State versus Oregon. And then at the very end, we'll come back and say goodbye. We'll do all of that next on Kings of Columbus. Big game breakdown brought to you by person who gives us money.
Yeah.
Offense, defense, we broke it down on both sides of the ball. We're going to start with the Oregon offense versus the Ohio State defense. This is you. And then I'll do the opposite side. And we're going to start Oregon passing game versus the Ohio State pass defense. Let me just break down a little bit of how big a game this is, by the way, though. It's the first game ever in Autzen Stadium between 2 top 5 teams. It is number 2 Ohio State versus number 3 Oregon. It's the first time Oregon's hosting a top 5 opponent since 2016. Ohio State does have a 9-1 edge in the series, but Oregon won the last matchup, 2021, a 35-28 win in Columbus. Kayvon Thibodeau, best player on Oregon, doesn't play. It doesn't matter. It's CJ Stroud's second start. Oregon wins. Joe Moorhead, the Oregon offensive coordinator, finds a thing that Ohio State's defense can't do, and he does it 75 times in a row.
It's the CJ Verdell crack sweep game.
Oh my God.
3 touchdowns.
There are crack sweep nightmares across Ohio that day. This is so Oregon's never played a number 1 team, or they've never beaten a number 1 team. So they beat number 2 Florida State in the semifinal in the Rose Bowl in the 14 playoff, but they've never.
They were one that year, right?
Yeah, I guess that's right. No, Alabama.
No, Alabama was.
Yeah, so they were 3. So anyway, and this would be Oregon's 9th win against the top 5 team. So, and they are going to play. So this is like where, like, it's interesting, like how this rivalry might evolve. I'll be curious how the fan bases react to each other, how Ryan Day and Dan Lanning react to each other. If there can be we had a big rivalry show on Tuesday, Landis, like Dan Wetzel, I was bringing up Farmageddon. He was like, do Kansas State and Iowa State hate each other? I was like, I don't know. They maybe just are like, man, we have a lot in common and let's play a great football game. And it's like, do you need hatred in a rivalry? I wonder if Ohio State and Oregon, as we do this thing, if they both continue at the top of the sport, and I think they will, if they can get a little bit of dislike in there.
Maybe. I wonder. I don't know. I don't know how heated the Oregon State rivalry is. Like,
I think it's
I'd imagine. Heated. Yeah. So if you are
and Washington.
Yeah. So whenever I think about like new rivalries, it's like, do you already have something in your life that can get you to that place of hatred? That like you discovering that feeling of hatred is not a new feeling to you. Like for Ohio State fans, they got all the hatred you can muster for Michigan. Like they'll throw some hate to somebody else too. But if you're like Penn State, for instance, right? Like Penn State doesn't have a natural rival anymore because it refuses to play Pitt. So like, is that do Penn State fans like really hate Ohio State? Or are they just like pretending they hate Ohio State because that's what they think they're supposed to do? What I'm saying is like they're not built for it. But I think Oregon fans might be built for it based on some other rivalries.
And the one thing, like Ohio State Clemson became a pretty good little mini rivalry in the playoff era because they were both very good. They played some high level important games, and Ohio State fans hated Dabo Swinney. So I do think and Dabo fed it a little bit. And I think Clemson then hated Ohio State too. And I do think Dan Lanning, as Stephen and I just discussed at length, does have enough of a persona and is not shy and is in like a great way. Like he stands up for his program. Ryan Day is less so, but if it starts with Dan Lanning not being afraid to put it out there, and if Oregon gets some wins, and then Ohio State fans are like, okay, we do not like this guy. And then Oregon fans are like, oh, you don't like our guy? Well, we don't like you. Like, I think that's where it would start. It would start with Dan Lanning's edge and Oregon wins. And that would get under Ohio State fans' skins, and then we're off and running. So no game next year, Oregon at Ohio State in 2026, Ohio State back at Oregon in 2027. Okay. Oregon pass game, Ohio State pass defense. What you got, Bill Landis?
So I was just watching a little bit more of, I was like kind of like rewatching highlights of the Oregon game against Boise State. And there's a play in that game, I think it was still in the first half, where Dylan Gabriel throws like a 7-yard pass to Trayshawn Holden, and one safety takes a bad angle, and Trayshawn Holden turns it into a 59-yard touchdown, and he and Tej Johnson are like racing to the end zone, and they high-five each other as they're crossing the goal line. And I was like, that's the Oregon offense. That's what Oregon would like to do. It would like to throw the ball short and hope you make a mistake, and then that's how they're going to get their yards. And I think that's where this sort of begins for the matchup of Oregon's passing offense against Ohio State's passing defense. It's Oregon's going to complete a lot of passes. It's like the nature of their offense. Dylan Gabriel leads the country in completion percentage. It's because he's 106 of 120 on throws that are either behind the line of scrimmage or within 9 yards of the line of scrimmage. He just doesn't throw the ball down the field a whole lot in this offense. And I think that's a nature of the offense more than it is the nature of Dylan Gabriel necessarily. Because if you look at Dylan Gabriel's average depth of target at his previous stops, it is at times like significantly higher than it is right now at Oregon. Like right now it's 6.5 yards. Last year at Oklahoma it was 10.2 yards. So he has been more of a downfield thrower, even if he's not great at it, doesn't have the best arm strength. Like he can do it reasonably well. I think he
throws an okay deep ball. I think he throws a pretty accurate deep ball.
He needs a lot of time and like really needs to step into it. But Oregon's offense just, I think, like wants to get it out quick, wants to maybe soften you up a little bit to try to get those big hits, but it is predicated on short passing. So
75%, like 75% of throws within 10 yards of the line of scrimmage.
27% of his throws are behind the line of scrimmage, which is the fifth highest rate among Power 4 quarterbacks. And almost 20% of his passes are screens. So I think people know what this is. Right? People saw the Bo Nix offense the last couple of years. Even when Kenny Dillingham was at Oregon, like it's more or less a similar style of passing that they're doing under Will Stein at Oregon now too. So like Ohio State, I don't think has seen a team that wants to attack you quite that way. I guess maybe the Marshall game plan, which provided some issues for Ohio State early in that game, which was like spread them out and make them cover the whole field. And then Ohio State, I think, compounded that a little bit by playing some softer coverages. And Marshall was able to move the ball a drive or two and score 2 touchdowns, which is the most a team has scored in Ohio State this year. So I think Oregon might try to mimic that coming into this game. That if you're going to take anything from Ohio State's defense in terms of matchups so far this year, I feel like that's probably the closest thing that Oregon can try to mimic, but obviously doing it with much better talent across the board. So I think that is Ohio State's got to be able to neutralize the short passing game and make sure that the team at Oregon right now is 10th in the country in yards after catch. Last year it was first, and it was first by more than 760 yards. Like they would just put it on teams running after the catch. It's not quite as good this year, but it's still really good. And that's how they want to do it. So that's the key for Ohio State is like, can you tackle these guys after they catch the ball?
I do think so. We've sort of had this conversation, a Bo Nix, Dylan Gabriel comparison. Bo Nix is bigger, more physical. I do think Dylan Gabriel is a better down the field thrower, though. To your point, he's done it more in his career, and I think his ADOT, average depth of target, is actually a little higher than Bo Nix was last year. I'm intrigued by how many shots Oregon might take. They took a shot to open the Michigan State game. They hit two deep balls. In the Boise game, they hit 2 important. One like just a deep sideline ball, and then one like a one over the middle of the field for like 30 yards for a touchdown. in the first half and then really didn't do much the rest of the game there. I am intrigued about how many shots they might take, because if the protection can hold up, like the thing I don't want people to take away from this is like they only dink and dunk, because it's like they dink and dunk 75% of the time, and then they might hit 3 shots in this game that really matter.
Yeah, they could. Bo Nix's average at the target, by the way, is slightly higher than he was. 6.8.
Okay.
Yeah, he was 6.
Okay.
It's practically the same. He's 6.8. Dylan Gabriel is now 6.5. I think the downfield stuff could maybe fall under the category of what hasn't Oregon shown all that much of yet, right?
Yeah.
I know there's a lot of people curious about this game, and two teams that haven't played the most challenging schedules in the world can probably get away with not showing the entirety of what they want to do on both sides of the ball. So maybe for Oregon, that is a little more verticality with its passing game. I if it happens, I do think it is probably like 2 or 3, right? I don't think it's going to be a situation where Dylan Gabriel's just like lining up and bombing it down the field on Ohio State. Because while I agree that he is probably a slightly better downfield thrower than he's getting credit for, it hasn't always looked great this year. I don't know if he's like dealing with something or what, but I think if you watch him earlier in his career, he was a little more effective doing it than he has been this year, even if he's not being asked to do it a ton right now.
What do you think of the personnel matchup? Tez Johnson, Trayshawn Holden, Evan Stewart as the top 3 receivers for Oregon against Denzel Burke and Davis Enigminosin as the outside corners and Jordan Hancock as the slot corners for Ohio State. Those are like 6 pretty high level guys.
Yeah, really fun matchups. I think that the one that's most interesting is Tez Johnson. I'm assuming getting covered by Jordan Hancock.
Yeah,
for a couple of reasons. One, Tez Johnson's really good, and Jordan Hancock's really good. But also, Jordan Hancock hasn't played a whole lot the last 2 weeks. Ohio State against Michigan State and Iowa played a ton of 4-3 against more kind of run-heavy looks. Jordan Hancock has only played 37 snaps combined the last 2 weeks. Now, he started off last year. He's a really good player. He's going to be a highly drafted player. Like I'm not questioning Jordan Hancock's talent by any measure. And he's really good against the run, too. I don't know that he's had to cover someone like this, right? And maybe they won't ask him to. Maybe I don't know. Maybe they'll have Denzel Burke follow Tez Johnson. I'm not sure. That'll be interesting to monitor. Maybe they'll zone it off and have the safeties get involved. I'm not entirely sure how much we'll see Jordan Hancock man-to-man against Tez Johnson, but those are two of that's one of the best slot receivers in the country, and in my opinion, one of the better nickel defenders in the country. So I don't know that the outside matchups, like Evan Stewart was a big time transfer, but I don't think he's been probably as impactful as Oregon was hoping that he would be. And Trayshawn Holden's a nice player too, but I would probably say the same thing about him. He transferred 2 years ago. So I probably like Ohio State on the outside a little bit, but
okay.
There's two spots that are interesting. One is the Tez Johnson in the slot that I mentioned, and the other is Terrence Ferguson at tight end. Just a big time target for Dylan Gabriel down the middle of the field. He is number 2 among power 4 tight ends in yards after the catch. So he's been a little bit of a big play guy for them. And I don't know who's going to cover him for Ohio State. I don't know if that's Sonny Styles as the will linebacker in a 4-2-5 is going to cover him, or are you going to have the safeties try to cover Terrence Ferguson? That to me feels a little bit like a X factor matchup that perhaps Oregon could exploit.
Dylan Gabriel's thrown 3 red zone picks in the last 2 games. The one against UCLA was a pick 6 a couple weeks ago. Just, I don't know, just like goofy throws a little bit. I mean, when the Michigan State game on Friday, I just think Brock Huard does a great job as an analyst. And he was talking about, it was sort of like a little out route in the corner, and you could see it. They froze it, and there was a little bit of space between the corner and the receiver, and making the decision of, is there enough room for me to get this ball in? And he tried it, and then the corner undercut it and made the pick. And against maybe some opponents that would work. Against a pretty decent Big Ten defense, it did not work. Obviously, Oregon's talking about it this week. They've got to be better. You can't have turnovers in the red zone in a game like this. I think I'm willing to just take it as 3 weird plays. How much of a concern do you think this is for Oregon? Because it is a good secondary, and it has happened the last 2 weeks.
Yeah, I'd be mildly concerned about it. I think there's a similar thing at play a little bit with Will Howard. Will Howard hasn't thrown red zone picks, but I think both of these quarterbacks maybe at times struggle a little bit with overconfidence and knowing what kind of
Yeah.
throws they're able to make. Like neither one of them, I think, has enough velocity on their throws to attempt the kind of throw that Dylan Gabriel was trying to attempt in that scenario. Now, Will Howard, I think, maybe has done that once for Ohio State in the red zone, and it wasn't picked off. So, yeah, there's a balance with that always. And I think in the games that Oregon has played thus far, maybe the gamble is worth it. But
Yes.
against this defense, I'm not so sure that it is.
Because I don't know that they have to gamble. And that's the thing about like taking the deep shots too. You take a deep shot on first down, you miss it, now you're off schedule. If they just stay on schedule and kind of do their thing, I do think the Oregon way has a chance to work. And I don't even mean that against the Ohio State defense. I think when they are clicking, it has a chance to work against anybody. And I think we have proof of that.
I think that is partly true. I guess that it is not, I don't think it's easy to go into a game thinking to yourself, oh, we're just going to drive the ball in this Ohio State defense and then finish with touchdowns, right? Like Ohio State actually has not been all that good in the red zone, but it's only been there 5 times defensively. So when you get it there, you can score. It has happened. But I don't think it's a reliable strategy. I do think Oregon's going to have to try to manufacture some big plays. If you think about the games that Ohio State has lost since Jim Knowles has been defensive coordinator, it has been because it has given up big plays, right? Maybe with the exception of the Michigan game last year. That was maybe not quite that mold, but the prior Michigan games, the Georgia game in the playoff semifinal, right? Like that's, and I think Ohio State's defense is a little different now. Like it is very cognizant of the fact that it has lost games because it has given up big plays, which is why you see so much off coverage with Ohio State this year. But I still think that's got to be the thought process for Oregon and maybe the thought process for any team in a game of this magnitude. It's why coaches get so hung up on explosive plays. Probably whoever has more of them in this game will win. If it becomes a drive the ball down the field kind of game, I think that suits Ohio State a little better than it does Oregon right now, based off how the two teams have played.
Run game. Ohio State running it with Jordan James. This offensive line for the Ducks that obviously has been reshaped after the past 2 weeks versus the Ohio State run defense. What do you think of this?
I think you have to start with the Oregon offensive line, which you mentioned, which has now settled on a starting 5 and has played with that group. I think this will be the 3rd full game they've played together as starters, but it kind of started the game before that where they sort of landed on this configuration, which is in the middle, which is Nashad Strother at left guard, Pancho Lalaulu at center, and Marcus Harper at right guard. Now that group has played some games together, the pass protection's been much better, but I know we're talking run game, and they've run the ball better. Like I think you've seen week to week Oregon's run game start to build on some things, and last week it was pretty impressive against Michigan State. So I would imagine that Oregon comes into this game feeling maybe not great about its ability to run the ball, but certainly better than it would have had it not turned around some of its earlier struggles. And Jordan James is a good running back. He's fairly elusive. He's got good balance. He finally started breaking through for some longer runs last week. He only had 2 runs of 15 plus yards before the Michigan State game. He had 5 against Michigan State. They got a second
really good last week.
Yeah, he looked
really good.
They got a second running back in Noah Whittington, who I think is a nice combination with him. But Jordan James is going to get the bulk of the carries. Dylan Gabriel will run a little bit, and maybe he'll run more in this game too. He to this point has run about at the same rate as Will Howard. I think we're expecting perhaps both those guys to see an uptick there in this game. That I guess the thing that's on my mind is like Ohio State just like shut down Caleb Johnson last week. He couldn't do anything. Ohio State owned the line of scrimmage against Iowa and shut down a guy who we thought coming into that game, and I still think is one of the best running backs in the country. Absolutely. Now, it didn't have to think about the passing game while doing that. So it can't. I don't think it can commit the numbers that it was committing to the run against this Oregon team because it'll spread you out because Dylan Gabriel can run. But I think getting Tyleik Williams back at defensive tackle is pretty massive here for Ohio State. Like if I see a vulnerability in Oregon's offense, I still think it might be the interior of the offensive line. So I might like the matchups with Tyleik Williams and Ty Hamilton there. So like those guys really have to control things to keep Oregon from kind of running the ball the way, especially the way it ran it last week against Michigan State.
Yeah, and it's so different from the first 2 weeks that it really was non-functional with the middle of that offensive line in the first 2 weeks. And the tackles weren't playing great either. And we haven't talked a ton about the Oregon tackles yet, but coming into the season, we thought Josh Connerly and a Johnny Cornelius were as good of a tackle combo as there was in the country. I think Johnny Cornelius has lived up to that. I think Josh Connerly at times has, but maybe hasn't been as consistent. But I do think the line's played pretty well the last couple weeks, and credit to Oregon for figuring it out. Because if they hadn't figured it out, they would be in a lot of trouble here. So I don't know that it's one of the best offensive lines in the country, but I mean, if that offensive line plays like they did in the first 2 weeks, like they don't have a chance. But I'm not expecting that will happen because they've really improved the last couple of weeks. And Jordan James, again, he'll get you some stuff. And I think he wants to bounce at times and get outside. And that comes back to what we talked about with the big game breakdown last week with Ohio State and Iowa, which is second level guys tackling in space. So now it's just a different type of running back. But Jordan James, I think he's one of the 5 highest graded PFF running backs in the power conferences. Like he is quite good. And the difference of, while Ohio State gets every bit of credit for shutting down Caleb Johnson and cutting out those explosive run plays against Iowa last week, it's such a different thing when you actually, as you said, have to worry about the pass game. And that's what you have to worry about with Oregon, is the balance.
Yeah. And because Oregon does play some 12 personnel, but not a ton. I don't know why it would. We talked about this last week. Like you can make Ohio State take Jordan Hancock off the field by playing a second tight end. Like that is a seemingly automatic response by Jim Knowles. He will go to a 4-3 the second you play 12 personnel. So you could do that if you're Oregon and then get Jordan Hancock off the field. But then I actually think you'd probably be doing yourself a disservice, right? I think you want to be in 11 personnel. You want 3 receivers out there as much as possible. Because the thing that Ohio State did do against Iowa was it was in a 4-3, like it had 4 defensive linemen and 3 linebackers, but it played Sonny style up on the line of scrimmage a fair amount. So it was really like a 5-man front with 2 linebackers behind it. And it's just not going to be able to do that if it is playing its nickel defense. So I think Ohio State will have to try to find some different ways to stop the run here than it landed on last week against Iowa. I just unless Oregon decides to play 12 personnel, which frankly would blow my mind. But that is something to watch. Like, can Ohio State still stop the run without playing as big and kind of as stout as it was against Iowa? I think it can. It's not like teams have run it on them otherwise, but it just becomes a different kind of game when you're trying to do that. So, and then this offensive line, I think is good, and it's doing it too. We talked a lot about Matthew Bedford on KOTN. I just think it bears repeating that, like, this was not their plan. They came in with the thought of playing Matthew Bedford at one of their guard spots. He just hasn't been healthy. He's a transfer from Indiana. So they were working around that. They were playing a walk-on to start at center for the first couple of games. So they've went through some trial and error to land on a group of 5 that has played pretty well the last couple of games. But I would hesitate yet to call it like a great offensive line. I would like to see what it does against a defensive line like this one.
Improved offensive
line. Definitely
but
improved.
Starting from a low point the first couple weeks.
Yeah.
All right, let's go to the opposite side of the ball. Let's talk about the Ohio State passing game versus the Oregon pass defense. Oregon 9 sacks the last 2 games.
Mm-hmm.
Jordan Birch had 2.5 last week. He was the Big Ten Defensive Player of the Week. He's playing with great violence, and he's the kind of person that shouldn't be blocked one-on-one. That's what Dan Lanning said about Jordan Birch. That's like he's giving Ohio State some tips. Like, don't try to block this guy one-on-one. They aren't going to blitz a ton. Oregon blitzed against Boise, but I felt like in the end they were actually like almost run blitzing, occasionally and like Boise would throw when Oregon thought they were run blitzing. So they wound up blitzing on pass plays like 3/4 of the time against Boise, but they just figured out early on against Ashton Genty that is like, we cannot let him get started. Let's get guys in the backfield. The rest of their games, their other 4 games, they're blitzing 30% of the time. So they're not going crazy coming after the quarterback. I think they are relying on their guys up front to do it. And Jordan Birch on the edge and Derek Harmon at defensive tackle Harmon has 25 pressures this year. That is third overall among all P4, all Power 4 defensive linemen, edge guys included. He has 25. Jordan Burch has 21. That's tied for 8th. So they have 2 of the top 10 pressure guys in the power conferences. Derek Harmon, the Michigan State transfer, is just incredibly disruptive. And so I am very curious how much pressure Will Howard is going to be under, because I do think Derek Harmon will be able to, against the Ohio State guards, be able to get in the backfield at times. And Jordan Burch is 295 pounds and it can beat you with the bull rush or can get around the edge. I am super intrigued, Landis, about this Oregon pass rush and how much they can affect Will Howard without having to bring extra guys.
Yeah, I believe that Ohio State is number 1 in the country in pressure rate allowed. So this is strength on strength, I think.
Yes.
But it also comes with the context of it's the same reason why Oregon only gave up 5 sacks all of last year. The ball gets out quick. Will Howard is not doing a ton of drop back passing. He's doing more than Dylan Gabriel this year, but still not a ton. So that helps the pressure numbers. You just don't have time to pressure Will Howard sometimes. But even with that, I think the offensive line for Ohio State has been much improved, both in the run game and the pass game. And I was really impressed with how Ohio State's offensive line handled Iowa's front last week. So I don't see like a decided edge, I guess, one way or the other. I'm just like pretty curious to see how it plays out. I do think like you're going to have for Ohio State, Tager Shabola as a still pretty young right guard trying to handle Derek Harmon and Jamari Caldwell at times. Like he'll be helped by having a super veteran center and a super veteran left guard and Seth McLaughlin and Donovan Jackson. But I do think that's a spot to watch. Like if Oregon can do some stuff to kind of blow up the middle of the offensive line and get some pressure on Will Howard that way, that's just not something that Ohio State has had to deal with yet this year. Now, I'm sure Chip Kelly might have workarounds for that, but how long does it take to work around it, and what's Oregon doing in the meantime, I think is the question, right? So that is, when you talk about Ohio State's offense against Oregon's defense, that's probably the most compelling sort of matchup is the interiors of the lines.
I think Oregon has like 3 truly standout defensive players in Jordan Burch on the edge, Derek Harmon on the defensive line, and Jabbar Muhammad as a cornerback, the transfer from Washington. And then they have a bunch of other really good guys. A lot of their secondary is built on transfers. Kobe Savage.
It's all transfers.
Safety, is it 100% transfers?
One of the 6 guys who have played the most snaps in the secondary, 5 are transfers, and 3 of them are transfers in their first year at Oregon.
This year, yeah. Brandon Johnson in the slot has played really well. I think we have 2 good slot matchups, right? That Emeka Ibuka and Brandon Johnson on this side of the ball, and Tez Johnson and Jordan Hancock on the other side of the ball. I think that's really interesting. I think the other outside corner spot, right, has been a little more up and down. Nico Reed, Dante Manning. Maybe you can get some work done there. I do think like Jabbar Muhammad is all over you. He plays excellent tight coverage. Oregon's second in the nation with 35 passes defended. So they do play the ball in the air pretty well. Jabbar Muhammad plays with so much confidence, just like the Ohio State corners do. Denzel Burke plays with so much confidence. These guys are not afraid to make plays in the air on the ball, get physical with you. Again, like Landis, the more we talk about this, they're so similar.
Mm-hmm. They're really similar.
In almost every way. They are really similar. Even in talking about some of the stuff, we know Oregon likes to throw short passes and get the ball out, and that kind of thing. Like this Ohio State passing game, Will Howard has only thrown 11 passes of 20 yards or more this season. Mm-hmm. That's tied for 60th in the Power 4. The only Power 4 quarterback with more attempts than Will Howard and fewer passes of 20 yards or more is Riley Leonard at Notre Dame. So, like, they are just not like Dylan Gabriel's thrown as much as we say, like, Will Howard.
I mean, not much more. I think Dylan Gabriel has like 2 more attempts than Will Howard does.
But we talk about how Oregon throws it short and doesn't take it right. I don't know that people think of Ohio State in exactly the same way, like philosophically. And so the point is that they're kind of similar in that way. Will Howard is the intermediate throws. Will Howard tries more intermediate throws. So like in the 10 to 19 range in the middle of the field, some of those wide hash outs kind of thing. Will Howard's going to throw more of those than Dylan Gabriel. And that might be the difference between these 2 passing games. But otherwise, it really is a lot of shorter stuff. And then it's just a heavy load to Jeremiah Smith and Emeka Egbuka on the targets for Ohio State. Emeka Egbuka, 41 targets. Jeremiah Smith, 29. Carnell Tate is next with 17 as the third receiver. The tight ends total have 18. The running backs total have 15. They know where their bread is buttered, Landis. And I expect Ohio State to throw the ball a ton again to senior slot Emeka Egbuka and freshman outside receiver Jeremiah Smith. And like, it is on, brother. Like, this is just, I don't know if Jabbar Muhammad's going to follow Jeremiah Smith or what we're going to do, but I think we're going to get a lot of Jeremiah Smith and Emeka Egbuka against Jabbar Muhammad and Brandon Johnson. And like, let's go.
I could see a scenario. I don't know if Oregon has historically traveled its corners or not, but I could see a scenario where Jabbar Muhammad follows Jeremiah Smith. But I also then think about what I had in mind last week against Iowa, which was you kind of have an interesting slot matchup with Emeka Egbuka and Sebastian Castro. You have an interesting outside matchup with Jeremiah Smith and Jamari, whose last name is escaping me, from Iowa. But then who covers Carnell Tate? And then Carnell Tate didn't play. So, like, you laid out the targets for Carnell Tate that comes with the context, like he missed a game. If that third position in Oregon's secondary is a little bit suspect, is that an opportunity for Carnell Tate to have one of the better games? Because he's really good too. He just gets overshadowed by Emeka Egbuka and Jeremiah Smith, understandably why. But it's mostly a two-man show, but it's not merely a two-man show for Ohio State at receiver. I think that's important to keep in mind here. Same deal for Oregon. Like, Oregon's got three receivers you have to worry about, and so does Ohio State. And Will Howard said something this week when asked about the Oregon defense, and like, I don't want to come off the wrong way, but he sort of hinted at, like, they have a lot of transfers on defense, and sometimes that can be a problem if guys aren't like fully on the same page quite yet. And I thought there was a play against Michigan State early in that game. They hit a fourth down throw to Nick Marsh, where Michigan State was in a bunch. They ran a
shot, like a 40-yarder.
And the three DBs on that side are like looking at each other like they don't know which one to cover. And then two defenders covered one receiver, and Nick Marsh just ran by Jabbar Muhammad for a huge gain. And if there are communication issues within Oregon secondary that they're still trying to work through, that is a ripe opportunity, I think, for this Ohio State passing attack and these receivers. So I'm on alert for that, and how Chip Kelly and Ryan Day might try to get those guys in a bind with formations or shifts and motions and that kind of stuff.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. And it's funny. It's like we're in the game of like, okay, the third receiver for Ohio State could be the deciding factor in this game because so much at the top is equal. There are a lot of excellent players in this game. And again, just the point is, I think the main takeaway, I think, for fans preparing for this game is it is more of a defensive battle, that these teams might be more defensive led than you realize, and that they are very, very similar in a lot of ways. Do you agree with those 2 points?
I do agree with those 2 points. Yeah.
Okay. So like that
defensive team. Yeah.
Keep that energy as you go into this. Again, like, Will Howard's average at the target is 7.8. That's 64th in the power conferences. Dylan Gabriel's 6.5. That's 74th. Like, it's not that they are trying to attack you the same way. And the whole point is they'll both take a couple shots, but both these teams are going to have explosive plays on 5-yard throws because that's the design, and that also is the talent. Yeah. And so they're not like Ohio State was able to hold down the explosiveness of Caleb Johnson as an Iowa running back last week, basically the entire game. He had one long run in the second half where he broke one tackle, and then he scored a touchdown against the backups. I don't think either side will be able to hold it down that way against the explosive offensive players, because both offenses are too balanced that you cannot focus on one thing. And the result is you're going to have to give something up. And I think both run games are capable of explosive runs, and both pass games are capable of short throws turning into explosive runs by the receiver.
I agree.
Ohio State run game versus Oregon run defense. The conclusion on the Ohio State run game is that it is almost ridiculously good. And I think people need to be prepared for that. Ohio State is third in success rate running the ball behind Army and UCF. And that's just how often you take care of business down after down after down, doing what you need to do to stay in front of the chains. They are also 7th in the nation in rushing explosiveness, which is how good and big your good plays are.
Mm-hmm.
So they are a very rare combo of efficient and explosive. This year, Ohio State is 3rd in success rate, 7th in explosiveness running the ball. Last year, they were 37th in success rate and 127th in explosiveness. As good as you again, if you think, they got to go chuck it around. As good as you think the Ohio State run game is, it's better.
I think that's right. It's precise. It's being executed at a really high level, and it's creative. And last year Ohio State was neither of those things. In years past, it has been fairly precise. I don't think it's ever been this creative. That is obviously the influence of Chip Kelly, and like Oregon's run defense has been improved right since the Boise State game. I think that's also worth pointing out. While
absolutely,
it's gotten stuff figured out on the trenches on the offensive side, I think that's happened on the defensive side too, defending the run. But I still, I watched the Boise game, right, and I've watched Quinshon Judkins and Travion Henderson run the ball, so I still feel like that is an advantage for Ohio State, even if Oregon is improved.
It's hard to tell. Genty is so nuts. I can't tell if you can take the Boise game as like an outlier for the Oregon defense of like, well, listen, man, like that guy's going to do that to everybody. That guy might do that to Georgia in the first round of the playoff, right? Like that, like that is right. I mean, like that, so that's the hard part of this because they've seen it. And they missed tackles in that game. They also had some missed tackles against Michigan State last week. Oregon did. The guys up front are real, as we talked about. Jamari Caldwell and Derek Harmon are real against the run game. I think the linebackers have played pretty well.
I actually think I think both those guys are, maybe Caldwell less so. Like I think Derek Harmon at times looks like a maniac against a run because he is very content to jump out of his gap to go try to make a play. So I think for every good play he makes, he might leave a vulnerability. I am wondering actually about how stout they are up front against the run. I think they're really good against the pass. I don't know that they're equally as good against the run.
I do think their backers run to the ball pretty well. I mean, there's like you can go back to the Boise game and see Jeffrey Bossa missing a tackle on the edge like early in the game, and it's like, oh no. But that's a lot of Ashton Genty in that. Bryce Bector's played really well. They'll get downhill on some stuff. Devin Jackson will get downhill on some stuff. I think they learned a lot. Actually, it's great preparation for this Ohio State run game. Ashton Genty is great prep. So they had better have learned some lessons. If they have not, again, it's one of those things. If this looks like the Boise game, Oregon's not winning.
No shot. Yeah.
They have to be more competent tackling in space and slowing down the Ohio State running backs before they get going. But also Ashton Genty is just crazy. And I think they should have learned some lessons. It does go back though. We talked about last week, Ohio State worked in Will Howard in the run game much more. They had 8 called runs for him. They were averaging about 2 per game called runs before that. That's going to be a factor in this game. And just to have a sense of the Ohio State backs, against Michigan State, Quinshon Judkins and Travion Henderson combined 18 carries for 123 yards. Against Iowa, they were 24 carries for 139 yards. But now, that's 24 carries for the backs last week, and now you add 8 Will Howard carries. So I'm super interested. Some of them are straight quarterback runs. Some of them are him keeping the ball in the zone read. I am super interested to see what the Will Howard run game looks like in this one, Landis.
I don't think we've seen all of what they want to do with that. It's been, for the most part, kind of fairly simple, just zone read stuff. They did try a couple of empty runs, as you mentioned there, there was a quarterback counter in there, I think, on one play, or maybe they tried to run inside zone on a 4th down that just wasn't quite blocked up right. There were 2 runs, right? One was blocked up really well, and Will Howard slipped, and the other one wasn't blocked up well at all, and it got stopped on 4th down. But there's more to get into there. I do think Will Howard probably needs to run a little more assertively on some of those design runs.
He's big. Let it rip.
Yeah, he does. He takes the thing. Will Howard, when he is 10 yards down the field, will surprise you with how fast he is. But it does take him a minute to get up to that. So I guess if Oregon can get to him early, maybe they can limit that run game a little bit. But I think that is one thing, even though we saw an uptick in it last week, there's a lot more to that quarterback run game, I think, that Ohio State hasn't shown quite yet that might come out in this game.
I do think this has a chance to be like, of all the four parts offensively, the Ohio State run game has the chance to be the thing that's most effective.
I 100% agree with that. Yeah.
And it's, again, a lot of this is conversations we've had at various times over the past several weeks, but just by PFF, and I'm not saying that's the end all be all, but the type of runs that they're doing, if you look last year with Trevion Henderson, they have him with 96 zone runs and 59 gap runs. In 2022, 82 zone runs, 24 gap runs. 2021, 132 zone runs and 50 gap runs, right? So zone, you're waiting for a running back to maybe make a bit of a read, find a cutback lane. And gap, you're just maybe following a pulling guy and getting downhill. He's run more gap plays than zone plays this year. And you can see them getting downhill and getting after people. And same with Quinshon Judkins. It's a split, but it leans a little bit gap when they had leaned much more towards a zone run game the past couple years. And for a game like this, I think you can see both the opportunities for both run games to get downhill, but man, Ohio State's really much more dedicated to that than they've been.
Yeah, if you look like overall, and that includes runs that aren't just Quinshon Judkins and Trevion Henderson, it's about 50-50 gap zone, which is great because this is a team that used to be like 80% zone.
Yeah.
And the other thing about it too, this used to be a heavy outside zone run game, and it is now inside zone that Ohio State is hanging its hat on, which also gives the feeling of them being more downhill. And also, they're awesome at inside zone this year. They average 6.7 yards per carry on inside zone, which is sixth in the FBS. Last year, they averaged 3.5 yards on inside zone, which was 127th in the FBS. So, it's a more veteran line that went through some lumps last year that I think is blocking well. They're helped with some of the designs that Chip Kelly has brought to the table as well. But this is not unless, I don't know, maybe Chip will scrap it and be heavy outside zone in this game. I don't know. But to this point, they've been a fairly heavy gap scheme team and a fairly heavy inside zone team.
I will say again, in the Boise game, you can find the plays where Oregon penetrates and hitch Ashton Jeanty in the backfield, and he just breaks the tackle. So if they make those tackles against Ohio State, because maybe the Ohio State guys are really good, but they're not the Heisman front runner, you make those tackles, it's a 40-yard difference. Yep. Or Oregon just raises its level, and Dan Lanning all week and Tosh Lupoi all week is saying hey, remember those missed tackles against Boise? Stop that. And they say, yeah, we're not going to do that anymore. So again, it was a great test that against the best running back in the country, they kind of failed the test, but now they get to take the test again. And I think they'll be better test takers. And even if the test is still very difficult, it might be 10% easier. And that could be the difference of oh God, thank God it's not Ashton Jeanty trying to break these tackles. He's so good.
He's really, I think Quinshon Judkins is pretty good in the zone right at breaking tackles, and Trevion Henderson has seemed much improved in that area this year. But I would not say that either one of them is quite as good as Ashton Jeanty is at running through contact.
No offense.
Yeah.
The last thing I just want to touch on super briefly. Oregon returned a punt and a kick for a touchdown in the Boise game, and they would not have won without it. Tez Johnson is pretty dangerous back there as a punt returner. Yep. Is there a special teams edge, especially in the return game for Oregon, do you think?
Yeah, I think so. Well, yeah, there definitely is, because Brandon Innes is a punt returner for Ohio State, has looked dangerous a time or two, but he hasn't broken through for one like Tez Johnson has, right? So
yeah,
I think so. I would, if I could get away with it, probably just not punt Tez Johnson the ball in this game.
Yeah,
which might feed into some aggressive calls, right? If it's fourth and reasonable, maybe Ohio and you're not on your own 25, maybe Ohio State will not want to punt the ball to Tez Johnson, because I wouldn't want to either. But we've talked a lot about Ohio State special teams. There's a new setup there. They don't have a full-time special teams coordinator. Ryan Day is more involved with it. That was yielding some good results early on. It's been maybe a little more mixed since then. So that could be an area where Oregon has an edge. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and that could, again, it won the Boise game. So that could really, that could be a difference maker here. Okay. You want to make picks? We ready to pick this thing?
Let's pick it.
I am super duper conflicted and unsure of what to do. What are you?
I was pretty clear on who I thought was going to win and more conflicted on the type of game I thought it was going to be.
Okay. This game in the preseason, in the offseason, was like a 1 or 2 point edge to Oregon, that Oregon was favored. Now it is at 3. Ohio State is a 3-point favorite in Autzen Stadium for this one. Arguably the biggest game in the history of Autzen Stadium. Landis, what do you have?
I'm picking Ohio State. I have Ohio State 31-28. And I think it could be a situation where I'm a little high on the score because I really could see this just being like a low possession, run the ball defense kind of game. Like for as much as conversations are going to be about the receivers and the quarterbacks, I think there's actually a very good chance that it becomes more of a slugfest that doesn't have a whole lot of scoring in it. But I like Ohio State's run game to win out if that's what it's going to be. I did have in the preseason when we were doing like win totals and all that stuff and record projections, I did have Oregon winning this game. I don't think Oregon has played well enough for me to pick them here. And it's interesting to me, like looking around at some other people picking this game. It's like, well, Ohio State hasn't seen anything like this yet. It's like, well, neither has Oregon. That's true of both sides. And the other thing I have in my head is like, okay, neither one of these teams has played a tremendous schedule to date. The best thing that Ohio State has seen is Iowa's defense, and Ohio State pretty much did whatever it wanted to do against Iowa's defense. And the best thing that Oregon has seen is Ashton Genty, and they couldn't stop him. So like that's in my head as I've kind of processed it too. And maybe that's being hyper focused on two things that don't have much to do with one another. But if we want to play that this team hasn't played anybody yet game, it applies to both sides. And at least one of these teams has handled the good thing that it has seen this year fairly well. So I'm picking Ohio State.
I mean, the best individual player that either team has seen is Ashton Genty. But we talked a lot about how good we think Caleb Johnson is. And we think Caleb Johnson is one of the 5 best running backs in the country. So the best running backs they faced, Oregon couldn't stop Ashton Genty, and Ohio State did stop Caleb Johnson, which is why I'm picking Oregon. What am I doing? So here's the thing. This is, I would not pick Ohio State. Excuse me. I would not pick Oregon in Ohio Stadium. I would not pick Oregon on a neutral site in the Big Ten championship game or in a playoff game, if that's what was happening right now. This is home crowd. This is, I believe, Dan Lanning's moment. This Oregon team's moment. I think this is the best version of Oregon. If you do not get the best version of Oregon, is a version better than you've seen so far. I don't think they're going to win, but this is a nod to, I think it's going to be nuts there. And I do think the travel will matter enough that it could factor into this one way or the other. And you talk about Oregon's ability to maybe match Ohio State a little bit in the how well we turn 5-yard throws into 70-yard touchdowns version of things. The ability of Derek Harmon and Jordan Burch to affect Will Howard. Will Howard in a road environment like this, not that he didn't play big games at Kansas State, but he's had a very good start to his Ohio State career. But from that perspective, this is the realest it's going to get for Will Howard as a Buckeye. While Dylan Gabriel's going to have the home crowd behind him, we have the same score for Ohio State. We both have them scoring 31, and I have one more touchdown for Oregon. So I have 34-31 Oregon. As much as we talked about the defense, this to me is both teams do turn a 5-yard pass into a 70-yard touchdown. Maybe they get after the passer enough, like we saw the Dylan Gabriel picks. Maybe there's just like a strip sack on Will Howard kind of thing. Like we've seen Ohio State defenders punch the ball out, like be aggressive in trying to force turnovers. Maybe there's a short field set up for both offenses. And I do think both offenses are competent enough to, not march time after time, but have a couple good drives in them. And if they both go, again, you talked about pace of play, if they maybe both go a little faster than they've been going. I think this is a well-played, high-level game where both teams are capable of winning and both teams look great. And I don't think this is not Ohio State blowing this. This is Oregon rising to the occasion. And I do think at home, like this is their moment for Oregon. I really do think that as much as the Washington game matters, like this is the prove it moment for Oregon. And then they've got some very interesting schedule stuff the rest of the way with some Midwestern trips. it's a big game for Ohio State. It is not the moment for them because they still have to go to Penn State. They still have to beat Michigan and break that 3-game losing streak. So I just think it's the absolute best version of Oregon, and that's enough. 31-34 Ducks. 34-31 Ducks, excuse me.
34. You think it's a last team with the ball or team with the ball last wins? Yeah.
I do. I mean, I think like Ohio State fans are having Dylan Gabriel nightmares the way they had Stetson Bennett nightmares. I think there's a version of that. And for all the things that I think, again, Dylan Gabriel, the Heisman favorite in the preseason, I think was wrong. But I think there's like a decent amount of Stetson Bennett of like, oh, okay, I'm getting the ball back with 3.5 minutes left, down 1. Okay, we can do this. Like, I think it's that kind of game. So this is not a sword in the ground. I'm not planting a sword on this. It wouldn't go in anyway. I am not planting my sword. I'm like throwing my sword up in the air. Like, I don't know. So I think I'll be surprised if they both don't play well though,
I'd be surprised if they both don't play well. You brought up a good point about teams getting put on short fields. Like, I was just in the process of looking some stuff up. It's a number that jumped out to me. Ohio State has been the beneficiary of good field position because of its defense and taking the ball away. 25% of its drives have started on a short field, which is like an FEI stat that is defined as like within 60 yards of the end zone.
Okay.
It's been good no matter where it has the ball. Like, I want to make that point clear, but it has not been in a game where it like constantly has to start at its own 20 or 25 and work the ball down the field and keep trying to score touchdowns. It has been helped a little bit by being on short fields. And maybe that is less of a factor here, provided Oregon doesn't give the ball away.
Yeah. And again, I mean, Jeremiah Smith had a goofy fumble, or Will Howard had a goofy throw there, and Dylan Gabriel's had some goofy throws, like, one thing like that, and it turns the game just like it always does. So I think it's high level. I think it's close the whole way. And I think both programs come away thinking like, okay, like, well, we might see you guys again and we'll take our shot. And by the way, look out rest of the country too. So, and I think maybe even in a better way than Bama, Georgia, because Bama, Georgia was, again, like a lot of what the opposing team didn't do in the halves when one team was good and one team was bad. I just am anticipating a little bit more of like both teams are good kind of all 60 minutes. I'm
gonna ask, I just see some of the people talk about this in the comments. Do you think Oregon's defense is better than Iowa's?
Do I think Oregon's defense is better than Iowa's? No. I think it might be more disruptive to the pass game.
Yeah.
I cannot believe how disruptive Derek Harmon is. I'm blown away by how often he's in backfields. I cannot believe it. 55, watch him. He's going to be in the backfield on passing. He's going to be at Will Howard's feet, screwing stuff up for Ohio State. I cannot believe how disruptive he is. Like 1 through 11, do your job, make tackles, not allow stuff. I'd probably take Iowa, but Jabbar Muhammad is excellent, and Jordan Birch and Derek Harmon are problems.
Mm-hmm.
And I think like Iowa's best player is a linebacker who forced a turnover in that game, right? Jay Higgins is that. But like I think Oregon's best defensive players might be at more impactful positions, especially when it comes to the pass game, in a way that might have a greater impact on the game, even if I think Iowa's better 1 through 11. What do you think?
I think they're so different stylistically that it's hard to compare. Oregon is more athletic. Iowa is probably more sound. Iowa wants to make you work it down the field and hope you get impatient enough to make a mistake.
Yes.
And I think Oregon will be aggressive to try to force you into mistakes. So that I think is a pretty stark difference between the two. But I also think the nature of the way that Oregon plays defense opens up more possibilities for big plays against them, which I think don't exist really against Iowa. So I could see maybe Ohio State having less down-to-down success against Oregon than it had against Iowa, but also hitting a bunch of big plays that it didn't hit against Iowa.
And I do think on the other side for this, like the explosiveness metric of what the Ohio State defense has faced with Iowa and Michigan State and the MAC schools and that kind of thing, like Oregon is just like so next level to that. So it's not, that is going to be, I'm very curious how, if Ohio State just like shuts that down. So I'm not I'm not pounding the table on anything. I think it's a close game, and I'm giving Oregon the edge because they're home, and Ohio State has to travel. Back on Kings of Columbus. Hope you guys enjoyed that big game breakdown. Landis, do you think I'm nuts for picking Oregon?
No, I don't think so. I think they're two pretty evenly matched teams, right? And you're picking the home team. Like I think there's a I don't know, a decent like Oregon's not that good sentiment that I feel like I'm picking up on a little bit this week, which I don't agree with. I think they are good. Maybe haven't played their best football yet, but if it does play its best football, it can beat Ohio State. So I think probably it needs to beat Ohio State, but they could find that game at home in that kind of environment this weekend. So I don't think it's nuts.
Yeah. I still think Ohio State's going to win the national championship.
Mm-hmm.
So this is all part of that. There is a question that we did not get to that it's almost, I mean, it's not funny, but I do think it is indicative of how well this season has gone so far for Ohio State. Eric, if Ohio State loses because of a porous game from Will Howard, does Ryan Day make a quarterback switch? That was like a interesting off-season theory of, okay, if this is not working, the Oregon loss is a line in the sand. Does that usher in the Julian Sayin era? We are not within sniffing distance of anything like that right now.
No, not at all. I was actually thinking about that the other day, how much of a talking point that was relative to this game. And I mean, people will perhaps bring it up if it happens. I don't think it's going to happen. Clearly, I picked Ohio State to win, but even if it did, I don't think we're having that conversation. It would take more than a bad game based off how Will Howard has played so far for that to happen.
And I think that would be the thing of, I don't know that. I mean, for instance, again, this is more of a Kings of the North discussion, but like Kansas State went to BYU and got blitzed and lost, kind of got blown off the field and turned the ball over and gave up a special teams touchdown and just like got lost. But it didn't make me think that Kansas State's not good. And I think that could be like a JV version of maybe what could happen here. You get in a crazy environment, you get blitzed a little bit, you make a mistake or two, and Oregon really makes you pay. Boy, everything goes their way, but it doesn't change who Ohio State is. And actually, like that, Kansas State just got rolled. That's not my pick, that Ohio State goes in and gets blitzed. My pick is that there's like a version of that happens, and it's just hard to overcome. That like Oregon does a lot right. Maybe the crowd's so loud it makes you take it's 3rd and 3 at an important time, and you get a false start penalty, that kind of thing. So it's just that. But I don't. I would not want people to think me picking. Here's the thing, and I'm not trying to be like thread the needle too much here. I think Ohio State is better than Oregon. I think Oregon's going to beat Ohio State. And I think in the 4-team playoff or the BCS, like saying things like that was like, what? Well, like, what are you? But in this version of college football, Bill, I think we have to get more accustomed to that thinking, because you don't have to be perfect. And sometimes good teams lose, and it doesn't mean you can't win a championship. So I'm not picking this way to make a point. But I think if it turns out that way, a point will be made for Ohio State fans, as many of our texters already expressed that we talked about.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think I agree with that sentiment too. And I also think when you're just trying to, if you're like assessing both sides here and you think to yourself, well, like picking Oregon sounds kind of crazy. I do think it is more difficult now to really assess the quality of teams when the rosters are so new year to year. So Ohio State has really hit the ground running, and yes, Ohio State has transfers, but doesn't have a lot of them. Like Oregon has a lot of them and is like still trying, I think, to figure out how all those pieces fit together. So if this is the game where it all comes together, like that, one, feels like a possibility, sure, and two, if that's the case, then I think that is a recipe for Oregon to win. So it's all part of the new world of college football. Like I think there's a little more parity because of just how different roster construction is now.
Yeah. And I would just advise this, and we'll leave you on this note. If Ohio State destroys Oregon, do not think that Oregon stinks. If Ohio State destroys Oregon, I think we will be back on Sunday Sound Off on Kings of Columbus, Landis, asking the question, is Ohio State a super team?
Mm-hmm. Death
Like,
Star mode.
That is it.
Yeah.
That it was like, oh, Doug was wrong. Why was Doug wrong? Because this is one of the 5 best teams in college football history. And they just absolutely proved it, right? Like, I think.
Yeah.
And then it's like, okay, I just didn't know that. I was maybe open to that idea, but wasn't sure that it was the case. And Will Howard was awesome, and the offensive line dominated, and we know what the backs can do. And holy moly, Jeremiah Smith and Ibuka went nuts, and the defense completely shut Oregon down. And they out schemed them, they out physicaled them, they out mentaled them. And if you can go win at Oregon, oh mama, you can do anything like that. I think that would be the conversation if that's what happens. Not Oregon was overrated.
That won't be my view on it. I try very much not to retroactively apply that kind of thought process to a game. Like, I thought Iowa was pretty solid, and I was impressed with Ohio State beating them. I think Oregon is very good, and I will be impressed with Ohio State beating them if that's what happens.
Yeah. And by the way, I've been wrong before. Believe it or not. Bill, have you heard that I was wrong one time?
Twice? Yeah, you've been wrong. We've all been wrong a time or two.
We've all been wrong. So I'm excited for it. I know everybody here watching and listening is excited for it. Thanks to our producer, Mike Yerstowski. And like, just like exciting. Just like exciting. This is what it's all about. Have a great Saturday, everybody. Keep listening and watching the podcast feed on YouTube and on your favorite podcast feed. But man, like, this is what it's all about. For Bill Landis, I'm Doug Lesmerises, and that was Kings of Columbus.